Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It's about a small black cat named Bastian. He wasn't wanted, not because of something he did, only because of the color of his fur. He learned early what cold streets feel like, how London sounds when the night goes quiet. And somewhere between the empty alleys and the long nights, something in him began to change. Not loudly, not all at once, just slowly, the way real things do. But before we walk beside him for a while, let's pause here together. You don't need to carry today anymore. There's nothing waiting for you right now. Get comfortable. Let your body settle into the bed. Take a slow breath and let it go when you're ready. I'll stay with you. Close your eyes and let me tell you the story of the King of the Night. Have you ever wondered why the shadows seem to bend when a black cat passes by? Or why, on the darkest nights, when the world of men sleeps, the cats remain awake, watching the void with eyes that see what we cannot? They say the night belongs to no one, that it is a kingdom without a throne, but that is a lie. The night has a king, and he paid a heavy price for the crown he wears. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders. Let me tell you the story of how a small, stray cat, made of hunger and soot, became the sovereign of eternal darkness. The story begins not in a palace, but in the gutter. It was a night in London that smelled of wet coal, rusted iron, and ancient secrets. The rain did not simply fall. It drummed against the cobblestones with cold, impatient fingers, playing a lullaby of misery for the forgotten souls of the city. For the humans, this night was merely an inconvenience. Men in long gray coats rushed toward their carriages, clutching their hats, blind to the world around them, desperate for the warmth of their fireplaces. They did not look down. Humans rarely look down. If they had, they might have seen a shadow detaching itself from the darkness of a narrow alleyway. Not a shadow cast by gaslight, but a living shadow. Small, trembling. This was Bastian. Bastian. He did not have a name back then, of course. Names are powerful things, gifts that anchor a soul to the world, and he had been cut loose. To the world he was just cat, or beast, or bad omen. He was huddled beneath the torn awning of an old bookshop, his paws tucked tightly beneath his chest to preserve a circle of warmth no larger than a saucer. He was a creature of absolute midnight. His fur was not simply dark, it was an absence of light, a void so complete that when he closed his emerald eyes, he seemed to vanish into the architecture of the city. But Bastian was not wild. Not yet. If you looked closely at his posture, you would see it. He did not crouch like a scavenger rat. He sat with a quiet, tragic dignity. His ears were not flattened in aggression, but swiveled forward in alert intelligence. Even soaked to the bone, even with hunger carving a hollow space between his ribs, Bastian possessed the bearing of a prince in exile. Hunger is a cruel storyteller. It forces the mind to remember feasts that are gone forever. As Bastian watched the dirty water run through the gutter, carrying dead leaves and scraps of newspaper, his mind drifted back, not to the cold stone, but to the memory of a rug, a Persian rug, thick, red, and smelling of lavender and dust. He remembered the warmth. It wasn't so long ago, perhaps a month, perhaps a lifetime in cat years, that Bastian had known the concept of home. He remembered an old woman. Her hands were wrinkled like parchment, but they were gentle. She would stroke the fur behind his ears and call him her little shadow. For a brief, golden time, Bastian believed that was his purpose, to be a companion, to purr against a human ankle and chase away the loneliness of an empty house. He was good at it. He was affectionate. He was loyal. But love, he learned, is fragile against the weight of fear. The memory shifted, turning darker. He remembered the day the nephew arrived. A tall man with a voice like grinding stones. A man who looked at Bastian not with kindness, but with a recoil of genuine horror. Bastian remembered the words, though he did not understand the human language fully. He understood the tone. He understood the vibration of hate in the air. "It's bad luck, Auntie," the man had said, pointing a trembling finger at Bastian's black coat. "A devil's familiar. You cannot keep a beast of this color in a Christian home. It draws the sickness in," the old woman had argued, her voice weak and wavering. "But fear is a contagion. It spreads faster than love." Bastian had tried to help. Sensing the tension, he had approached the man, offering a gentle headbutt against his boot, a gesture of peace. The kick that followed had lifted him off the floor. The memory was painful, but Bastian could not look away from it. It was the wound that defined him. He remembered the box, the darkness inside it, the rattling of a carriage, and then the sudden rush of cold air, the lid opening onto a street he did not know. He had looked up, expecting a game, expecting to be called back. Instead, he saw the face of the man, twisted in self-righteous disgust, and behind him the weeping face of the old woman, turning away in shame. "Go," the man had hissed. "Go back to the devil." The door had slammed. The sound was final. It was the sound of a universe closing. Bastian had waited by that door for 3 days. He waited until the rain washed away his scent. He waited until hunger forced him to move. He realized then the terrible truth of his existence. His crime was not something he had done. His crime was what he was. He was born the color of the grave. And for that sin, he was sentenced to walk the edges of the world, unseen and unwanted. A carriage wheel splashed through a puddle, sending a spray of icy mud onto Bastian's flank. He flinched, snapping back to the present. The memory dissolved. He was Bastian the exile again. He shivered. The cold was different tonight. It wasn't just the winter chill. It was a supernatural frost that seemed to seep from the very stones of London. He looked down at his paws. They were muddy and sore. Why keep going? The thought was seductive. It would be so easy to simply stop, to close his emerald eyes and let the cold take him, to become just another pile of wet fur in the morning light, stepped over by the busy crowds. But Bastian felt a spark inside him. It was a small, hot coal of defiance, burning deep in his chest. "No," he thought. "I will not give them the satisfaction of my death." He wasn't just a stray. He was a survivor. And more than that, he was a watcher. Even in his misery, Bastian noticed things that other cats missed. He saw the way the gaslight flickered when no wind blew. He saw the faint, translucent threads that connected sleeping humans to the stars above the clouds. And tonight, he saw something new. The fog at the end of the alley was thickening. It swirled with an unnatural intent, coalescing into shapes that made the hair on his spine stand straight up. Most animals would have run. A dog would have barked and fled. But Bastian was a black cat. He was born of the omen. He was molded by the superstition that feared him. If the world thought he was a creature of the dark, perhaps it was time to look the darkness in the eye. He stood up. He shook the water from his coat, and he stared into the swirling fog, waiting for whatever nightmare was coming to claim him. He did not know it yet, but the waiting was over. The invitation was about to arrive. The fog did not behave as fog should. It did not drift, it marched. It rolled down the narrow alleyway like a living carpet, swallowing the cobblestones, the discarded crates, and the flickering gaslight one by one. Where the fog touched, the world vanished. The sound of the London rain, that relentless drumming that had been Bastian's only companion, was suddenly cut short. Silence fell. Absolute, heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums, the silence of a held breath before a scream. Bastian pressed his back against the cold brick wall. His fur stood on end, not from the cold, but from the static electricity that now crackled in the air. His whiskers twitched, tasting the scent of ozone and ancient dust, the smell of a storm that had raged for 1,000 years. Then, out of the swirling gray wall, it emerged. It was a carriage, but it was not built by human hands. It had no wheels to clatter on the stones. Instead, it hovered inches above the mud, gliding on a cushion of shadow. Its body was carved from a single piece of obsidian, blacker than the night itself, polished until it reflected not the alleyway, but a sky filled with stars that had never been seen from Earth. There were no horses pulling it. There was no driver holding the reins. The carriage moved with a sentient purpose, drifting until it came to a halt directly in front of the small, shivering cat. Bastian did not move. He was frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the paralyzing awe of the supernatural. For a long moment, nothing happened. The carriage simply sat there, a monolith of darkness in the gray world. Then, with a sound like a sigh escaping a tomb, the door swung open. There was no light inside, only a velvet darkness that seemed deeper, warmer, and more inviting than anything Bastian had ever known. A voice floated out from the interior. It was a voice like the rustling of dry leaves in an autumn wind, old and weary, yet carrying an undercurrent of immense power. "You are cold, little watcher." Bastian blinked. The voice had not spoken in the bark and growl of animals, nor in the clumsy, loud tongue of humans. It spoke directly to his mind, in the universal language of thought and intent. Bastian found his voice a small, cracked mule that felt insignificant against the silence. "Who are you?" he projected, his thoughts trembling. "Are you death?" A low, rumbling chuckle emerged from the carriage. It was not a cruel sound. It sounded like a purr magnified 1,000 times. "Death is my sister," the voice replied gently, "and she will come for you one day, as she comes for all things. But not tonight. Tonight, it is I who have come." A shape shifted within the shadows of the cabin. 2 eyes opened in the darkness. They were not green like Bastian's, nor yellow like a common cat's. They were violet, swirling with nebulas and distant galaxies. "I am the keeper of the threshold," the entity said. "I am the last of the line, and I have been looking for you." Bastian flattened his ears. "Looking for me?" He asked, bitter resentment leaking into his thoughts. "I am nothing. I am bad luck. I am the stain on the rug. The humans threw me out because I carry the devil's color." "Fools," the voice hissed, and for a second the temperature in the alley dropped 10 degrees. "Humans are blind creatures. They fear what they cannot tame. They looked at your fur and saw an omen of evil, but they were wrong." The giant spectral eyes narrowed, focusing intensely on Bastian. "They feared you not because you are evil, Bastian. They feared you because deep down in their primitive souls, they recognized you. They recognized royalty. They knew instinctively that you belong to the night, and the night is the one thing they cannot conquer." Bastian felt a strange sensation in his chest. The shame that had weighed on him for days, the crushing feeling of being unwanted, began to crack. Royalty? Bastian whispered. The crown of silence seeks a head to rest upon. The Ancient One said, my time is ending. The stars are dimming in my eyes. I need an heir. I need a heart that has known the cold, so that it may appreciate the warmth. I need a soul that has been broken, for only broken things can be rebuilt stronger. A paw extended from the carriage door. It was massive, translucent, and shimmered like moonlight on dark water. It offered a ramp, a bridge from the cold, wet reality of London to something else entirely. Come, the voice commanded, soft but irresistible. Leave this world of gray rain and hard boots. Leave the hunger. Leave the names they called you. Step into the dark and find out what you truly are. Bastian looked back one last time. He looked at the puddle reflecting his own ragged silhouette. He looked at the closed doors of the houses where families slept, warm and safe, indifferent to his existence. He realized he had nothing to leave behind. The world of men had made its choice. It had rejected him. Now it was his turn to reject them. Bastian stepped forward. He placed his small, muddy paw onto the spectral ramp. It felt solid, warmer than stone. He climbed. With every step, the cold receded. The pain in his ribs faded into a dull memory. He entered the carriage, and the velvet darkness wrapped around him like a mother's tongue, grooming away the filth and the sorrow. The door clicked shut, sealing the silence. Outside, the fog dispersed. The rain resumed its drumming on the empty cobblestones, but the alley was empty. The shadow was gone. Bastian had left the world of men. The journey to the kingdom of night had begun. Bastian walked. It was a simple action, one paw in front of the other, yet here, on the polished stones of the Citadel, it felt like learning to walk for the first time. In London, the ground was hard, cold, and dead. It pushed back against you. Here, the ground hummed. The moonstone floor seemed to vibrate with a low, resonant frequency, a purr that came from the planet's core, massaging his tired muscles with every step. He followed the ancient king, who moved not like a solid being, but like a cloud of smoke drifting through a valley. They approached the great doors of the palace. These were not doors made of wood or brass. They were sheets of falling water, dark, glittering curtains of liquid night that defied gravity, flowing upward toward the archway. Do not be afraid, the ancient king's voice echoed in Bastian's mind. Water is memory. Pass through it, and let it remember you. Bastian hesitated. Water was the enemy of street cats. It meant cold. It meant sickness. But he looked at the king, who passed through the liquid curtain without getting wet, his starry fur only shining brighter. Bastian closed his eyes, flattened his ears, and stepped through. There was no splash, no shock of cold. Instead, he felt a tingle, a static charge that ruffled his black fur from nose to tail tip. He opened his eyes. He was inside the great hall of the night. If the outside had been breathtaking, the inside was incomprehensible. The ceiling was not a roof, but the cosmos itself, brought down so close you could almost bat at the comets trailing overhead. The walls were lined with pillars of translucent quartz, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent blue light. But it was not the architecture that made Bastian stop in his tracks. It was the inhabitants. The hall was filled with cats, hundreds of them. But these were not the cats Bastian knew from the alleys of London. These were not the scrawny, flea-bitten survivors fighting over fish bones. These were the high spirits. Resting on velvet cushions that floated gently in the air were cats of every breed imaginable, but elevated to their divine forms. There were Siamese cats with eyes like blue diamonds, wearing collars of woven starlight. There were massive Maine Coons, whose fur looked like storm clouds, crackling with tiny flashes of lightning. There were hairless Sphinx cats, their skin etched with glowing golden runes, sitting like statues of ancient wisdom. They were grooming themselves, purring in a collective harmony that sounded like a choir of cellos. As Bastian entered, the purring stopped. Hundreds of heads turned, hundreds of eyes, gold, copper, emerald, sapphire, fixed upon him. Bastian shrank. He tried to make himself small, an old habit from the streets. He was acutely aware of his own state. He was muddy. His fur was matted with rain and grime. His ribs showed through his coat. He had a notch in his left ear from a fight with a rat. He was a jagged, broken thing in a room full of perfection. A murmur ran through the hall. It wasn't a spoken language, but a wave of telepathic whispers that Bastian could feel pressing against his skull. Astray. Why has the king brought a mudwalker? He smells of the gray world. He smells of fear. Look at his paws. They are dirty. He stains the sacred floor. A white Persian cat, beautiful and terrible, floated down from a high ledge. She landed soundlessly in front of Bastian. Her fur was so white, it hurt to look at, and her eyes were two chips of ice. My king, she projected, her mental voice sharp as a crystal shard. You have returned. But what is this shadow you drag behind you? The ancient king stopped. He turned his massive, galaxy-filled head toward the white cat. This, the king said, his voice booming like thunder, silencing the whispers, is my guest, Lyra, and you will treat him with the courtesy due to one who has walked the hard path. Lyra sniffed the air near Bastian, wrinkling her nose. He is starving, she noted coldly. He is weak. His spirit is as thin as his body. Why bring him here? The crown requires strength. The crown requires a lineage of magic, not this. Bastian wanted to hiss. He wanted to bare his teeth and show her that street cats had sharp claws too, but he didn't, because he feared she was right. He looked at the grandeur around him. He looked at the king, who was essentially a god. And then he looked at his own reflection in the quartz pillar. A small, skinny black cat with desperate eyes. I am a mistake, Bastian thought. He picked the wrong alley. The ancient king lowered his head until he was eye level with Bastian. The universe in his eyes swirled. They see dirt, Bastian, the king whispered, private and kind. But I see the carbon that becomes the diamond. Do not let their shine blind you. They were born in the light. They have never known the dark. And because they do not know the dark, they cannot rule it. The king stood up, addressing the entire hall. Prepare the bath of renewal, he commanded. Feed him the nectar of the moon. Tonight, the stray dies. Tonight, the prince is born. The king turned and began to walk toward a spiraling staircase at the far end of the hall. Bastian stood alone for a second, feeling the weight of the court's judgment. He looked at Lyra. She did not bow. She merely narrowed her icy eyes. Don't get comfortable, little shadow, she whispered. The night eats the weak. Bastian straightened his spine. He remembered the cold rain. He remembered the boot that kicked him. He looked Lyra in the eye. I have eaten garbage and slept in the snow, Bastian projected back, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. I am not afraid of the dark. I am the dark. And with a flick of his tail, Bastian turned and followed the king. leaving the silence of the court behind him. He began to climb. Chapter 2: The Kingdom of Twilight. The spiral staircase wound upward like a ribbon of smoke, twisting higher and higher into the anatomy of the castle. Bastian followed the ancient king, his small paws making no sound on the obsidian steps. With every turn of the spiral, the murmurs of the high court below faded, replaced by a silence that was thick and private. This was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a library or a temple, a silence that held secrets. They reached the top. The king paused before a circular archway draped in curtains of sheer, shifting violet light. "Enter," the king said, his voice softer now, stripped of the command he used in the great hall. "This is the chamber of renewal. No judgment enters here, only truth." Bastian stepped through the curtains. The room beyond was warm. It smelled of old paper, burning sage, and the sweet metallic scent of a thunderstorm that has just passed. In the center of the room lay a pool, but it was not filled with water. It was filled with something that looked like liquid mercury mixed with crushed diamonds. It swirled slowly, glowing with a gentle, internal rhythm. "You are carrying the weight of the gray world on your skin," the king observed, looking at Bastian's matted, muddy fur. The rain of London, the soot of the chimneys, the fear of the broom, and the boot. "You cannot wear those things here." Bastian looked at the pool. His instinct screamed danger. In the alley, getting wet meant freezing. It meant death. "It is not water," the king reassured him, reading his hesitation. "It is starlight in liquid form. Step in, Bastian. Let it wash away the memory of the cold." Bastian approached the edge. He extended one trembling paw and touched the surface. It wasn't wet. It felt like velvet. It felt like standing in a sunbeam on a warm afternoon. Slowly, driven by a bone-deep exhaustion, Bastian stepped in. He submerged his tired legs, then his hollow belly, and finally, he sat down, letting the liquid light rise to his chin. He expected to panic. Instead, he sighed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. As the starlight soaked into his fur, the mud dissolved instantly. But it did more than clean him. The ache in his ribs, where the stone had struck him, vanished. The constant gnawing itch of the fleas ceased. The tension in his muscles, coiled tight from months of sleeping with one eye open, finally unraveled. The black grime of the city floated away, leaving his coat not just clean, but transformed. His fur became sleek, glossy, and impossibly soft. It drank in the light of the room and held it. Bastian closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt safe. "Rest," the king murmured, settling himself on a large cushion nearby. "The body must heal before the spirit can learn." A silver bowl materialized at the edge of the pool. Inside, there was no fish or scraps. There was a golden liquid, thick like honey. "Drink," the king said, "nectar of the Selenites. It will fill the hollow places inside you." Bastian lapped at the bowl. The taste was indescribable. Like warm milk, like vanilla, like the feeling of being loved. With every swallow, the ghost of hunger that had haunted him for so long was banished. His strength returned, not as a manic burst of energy, but as a solid foundation. When Bastian finally stepped out of the pool, he was dry instantly. He sat down and wrapped his tail around his paws. He looked at his reflection in a polished mirror on the wall. He barely recognized himself. The jagged, frightened stray was gone. In the mirror sat a creature of elegance. His black fur was midnight perfect. His green eyes were clear and sharp. He looked noble. "Better," the king rumbled. a hint of a purr in his voice. "Now, we can talk." The king rested his chin on his paws, his galaxy eyes fixing Bastian with an intensity that felt heavy. "You asked yourself downstairs why I chose you," the king began. "You saw the high spirits, the purebreds, the magical ones. You wondered why the king of night would descend to a gutter to pick an heir." Bastian nodded slowly. "Lyra was right," he projected. "I have no magic. I do not know how to float. I do not know the songs of the stars. Magic," the king corrected gently, "is cheap. Here, everyone in this castle can float. Everyone can conjure light. That is not what makes a king." The Ancient One lifted his head, looking up at the ceiling where constellations drifted like clouds. "To rule the night, Bastian, you must understand what the night is." "It is dark," Bastian said simply. "Yes, but humans fear the dark. They think it is where monsters hide. They think it is evil." The king's expression turned sad. "That is the great lie. Darkness is not evil. Darkness is mercy." Bastian tilted his head. "Think of the sun," the king continued. "The sun is harsh. It reveals every flaw. It burns. It demands work, action, noise. Under the sun, humans must toil. They must pretend. They must fight." The king paused. "But the night forgives. The night covers the world in a soft blanket. It allows the weary to close their eyes. It allows the broken to dream of being whole. The night is the only time a soul can truly be free." The king looked back at Bastian. "I did not choose a high spirit because they have never suffered. They have never been cold. They do not know how precious warmth is." The king leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in Bastian's bones. "You know the cold, Bastian. You know the pain of being alone in the dark. And because you know that pain, you will fight to protect others from it. You will not rule with arrogance. You will rule with empathy." Bastian absorbed the words. They settled in his chest, heavier than any meal. "Is that why I am here?" Bastian asked. "To protect the sleep of humans?" "That is the duty," the king agreed. "But there is another reason." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The warm light of the pool dimmed slightly. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, becoming sharper. The king looked old suddenly. Very, very old. The stars in his eyes flickered. "I am fading, little watcher. My time is done. And as my light fails, something else is growing." "What is it?" Bastian felt a prickle of fear along his spine. "There is a difference between the night and the void," the king said gravely. "The night is a blanket. The void is a mouth. It does not want to cover the world. It wants to eat it. It wants to consume the dreams, the stars, and the souls of the sleepers." The king stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the small black cat. "An enemy is coming, Bastian. One that I can no longer fight. I have brought you here, not just to be a king, but to be a warrior." The king stood up, his joints cracking with the sound of shifting tectonic plates. He gestured for Bastian to follow. They left the warm sanctuary of the bathing chamber and stepped out onto a high balcony carved from the living rock of the Citadel. The air here was thinner, sharper. It tasted of ozone and absolute silence. Below them lay the abyss, but it was not empty. Bastian looked down, and his breath hitched in his throat. Stretching out beneath the floating continent of the Night Kingdom was the world of humans. It looked like a vast, turning sphere of blue and gray shadows. But what captivated Bastian wasn't the planet itself. It was what rose from it. Millions upon millions of silver threads were ascending from the surface of the world, rising like reverse rain into the cosmos. They were delicate, shimmering strands of light, swaying gently in the astral wind. Some were bright and thick, the deep, restorative sleep of the content. Some were frayed and flickering, the restless dozing of the worried. And some were dark, tangled knots, the sleep of the sick or the grieving. Behold, the ancient king whispered, looking out over the infinite field of silver grass, the tapestry of somnus. Bastian stepped to the edge of the balcony, his claws extending instinctively to grip the stone. The scale of it was dizzying. Every thread you see is a human soul, the king explained, tethered to their bodies but wandering here, in our domain. While they hold these threads, they are vulnerable. They are open doors. Bastian watched as winged shapes, the high spirits he had seen in the hall below, glided among the threads. They moved with the grace of owls, silent and precise. He watched a large gray cat descend upon a thread that was turning a sickly shade of green. The gray cat didn't attack. It simply purred, rubbing its spectral body against the thread. Instantly, the green faded. The thread turned silver again. The vibration of the string calmed. They are repairing a nightmare, Bastian realized aloud. They are weavers, the king corrected. They smooth the knots of anxiety. They chase away the minor shadows. They ensure the human wakes up refreshed, remembering nothing but a vague sense of peace. It looks peaceful, Bastian noted. It looks peaceful because we are vigilant, the king replied darkly. He pointed a massive paw toward the far horizon of the tapestry, where the light of the threads faded into a deep, impenetrable gloom. Look closer, little watcher. Use the eyes the street gave you. Bastian narrowed his green eyes. He pushed past the beauty of the shimmering lights. He looked for what was wrong, and then he saw it. At the edges of the field, things were moving. They were not cats. They were not elegant. They were shapes made of oil and jagged angles, like insects made of smoke. They skittered along the periphery, testing the threads, looking for weak points. Parasites, Bastian hissed, his tail twitching in agitation. Small ones, the king agreed. Scavengers. They feed on fear. My weavers keep them at bay easily enough. But lately, they are becoming bolder, and they are becoming larger. Suddenly, one of the silver threads near the balcony began to vibrate violently. It wasn't just shaking, it was screaming. A silent psychic scream that echoed in Bastian's mind. He saw a dark shape, larger than the others, like a wolf made of tar, latch onto the thread. The silver light began to turn black, rotting away at the touch of the monster. Bastian felt a surge of adrenaline. Someone is hurting, he projected. Watch, the king commanded. Do not interfere, observe. Below, two of the high spirits swooped down. They were efficient. They blasted the tar wolf with beams of white light from their eyes. The monster dissolved into mist, but the thread remained damaged. It was gray and thin, barely holding together. The spirits looked at it, nudged it once, and then flew away to the next problem. They saved the thread, Bastian said, confused. But they didn't fix it. They drove away the monster, the king said sadly. But they did not heal the trauma. That human will wake up screaming. They will carry that fear for days. The king turned to Bastian. My high spirits are soldiers. They are perfect beings of light. They understand how to fight darkness, but they do not understand fear. They have never felt it, so they cannot heal it. The king leaned in close. But you? When you looked at that rotting thread, you felt it, didn't you? You felt the cold in your stomach. You felt the panic of being trapped. Bastian nodded. I felt it. That is your gift, the king declared. You are not just a weaver. You are a mender. You can walk into the nightmare and understand it from the inside. You can guide the dreamer out because you know the way out of the dark. The king turned away from the balcony, walking back toward the shadows of the palace. But empathy without strength is just suffering, the king warned. To help them, you must be stronger than the fear that eats them. You must learn to walk where the shadows are thickest without losing yourself. He stopped in front of a heavy iron door. It was covered in rust and ancient scratches, as if something had tried to get out many times. Your training begins now, Bastian. Bastian looked at the door. He could hear sounds coming from behind it. Not the soothing hum of the palace, but the sound of wind howling through a graveyard, the sound of dry branches breaking. What is behind there? Bastian asked, his fur rising. The forest of echoes, the king said. It is a place where your own doubts take physical form. A place where every noise you make summons a predator. The king looked at Bastian with a solemn expression. To rule the night, you must first master silence. You must walk through that forest and reach the other side without breaking a twig, without whispering a thought, without being seen. And if I am seen? Bastian asked. The king did not answer immediately. He simply pushed the iron door open. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out, smelling of dead leaves and old graves. Then you will wake up back in the alley in London, the king said softly, cold, hungry, and forgotten, and the night will wait for another heir. Bastian looked into the darkness of the open door. He thought of the warm bath. He thought of the nectar. He thought of the power he had felt. Then he thought of the cold rain and the feeling of being kicked. He dug his claws into the stone. I am not going back, Bastian said. Then walk, the king commanded, and do not make a sound. Bastian stepped through the iron door, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 3. The Way of Silence. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind him. The sound was not a bang, but a dull thud that seemed to be instantly swallowed by the air, like a stone dropped into deep mud. Bastian stood frozen, his tail low, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. He waited for the echo of the door to fade, but there was no echo. The silence in this place was aggressive. It was not an empty silence, it was a hungry one. It pressed against his eardrums, demanding to be broken, daring him to make a mistake. Bastian looked around. He was no longer in the gleaming moonstone corridors of the Citadel. The geometry of the Night Kingdom, the perfect spires, the logical bridges, was gone. Here, nature had grown wrong. The Forest of Echoes was a landscape of gray and charcoal. The trees were ancient, their bark stripped away to reveal wood that looked like bleached bone. Their branches did not reach up toward the sky. They twisted and knotted around each other, forming a claustrophobic ceiling that blocked out the stars. There was no wind here. The air was stagnant, smelling of dry rot and old dust. Nothing moved. The world was held in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a trigger. Bastian looked down at his paws. The ground was the trap. It was not covered in soft moss or grass. It was a minefield of brittle dead leaves, thousands of them. They were dry, curled, and crisp, the kind of leaves that crunch with the violence of a breaking window if you step on them carelessly. Interspersed among the leaves were twigs, thin as spider legs, and just as fragile. Bastian understood the test immediately. In the alleyways of London, stealth was a way to avoid a kick or a bucket of water. It was a matter of comfort. Here, stealth was a matter of existence. The ancient king had said, "Where every noise you make summons a predator." Bastian took a breath, holding it in his lungs to steady his heart rate. He focused. He summoned the memory of the hunt. He remembered stalking a pigeon on a slate roof, where a single slip of a claw meant losing a meal for 3 days. He lowered his center of gravity. He lifted his right front paw. He did not just lift it. He unweighted it, shifting his mass seamlessly to his other 3 legs. He extended the limb in slow motion, watching the ground with microscopic intensity. He saw a dry leaf. He adjusted his aim by an inch. He saw a twig. He adjusted again. He found a patch of bare, gray dirt, larger than a coin. He lowered his paw. He did not stomp. He placed the pads down first, letting the soft velvet of his feet test the surface, feeling for any instability. Only when he was sure the ground was solid did he transfer his weight. 1 step. Silence. Bastian exhaled slowly. 1 step down. 5,000 to go. He moved deeper into the forest. Time seemed to distort here. Every step took 10 seconds of calculation. Lift, hover, scan, place, shift. It was a meditation of movement. As he walked, his eyes adjusted to the gloom. He began to see that he was not alone. The trees were not just trees. High up in the tangled branches, shapes were hanging. They looked like cocoons made of gray silk, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Inside them, Bastian could see shadows shifting, sleeping things, waiting things. He realized with a jolt of horror that the predators were not patrolling the ground. They were the canopy itself. They were dormant, waiting for a frequency to wake them up. A sound, a snap, a crunch, a sneeze would be the dinner bell. Bastian crept under a low-hanging root. His black fur blended perfectly with the shadows, but his physical form felt clumsy. He felt too heavy. He felt like a sack of meat and bones trying to pretend he was a ghost. "I am not a spirit," he thought frantically. "I am a cat. I have weight. I have mass." As if the forest heard his doubt, a small pebble, dislodged by his back foot, rolled. It was a tiny movement, but it hit a dry leaf. Click. The sound was microscopic. In London, it wouldn't have been heard over the rain. Here, it sounded like a gunshot. Above him, 3 of the gray cocoons stopped pulsing. They froze. Then they ripped open. Bastian froze, pressing his belly into the dirt, turning himself into a stone. From the cocoons dropped 3 creatures. They were the listeners. They were vaguely feline in shape, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, with too many joints. Their skin was pale and hairless, stretched tight over bone. But the most terrifying thing was their heads. They had no eyes. Their faces were smooth, blank masks of pale skin, except for the ears. Their ears were enormous, disproportionate, swiveling independently, twitching with frantic speed. They were scanning the air, dissecting the silence, looking for the source of that tiny click. One of the listeners landed on the branch directly above Bastian. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle teeth, and let out a sound. It wasn't a roar, it was a click. Click, click, click. Echolocation. The sound waves washed over Bastian. He felt them hit his fur. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't breathe," he commanded himself. "Don't heartbeat. Become the void." The listener tilted its head. It sniffed the air, but these creatures did not hunt by scent. They hunted by vibration. Bastian controlled his trembling. He forced his muscles to unlock, to become liquid. If he tensed, his muscles would vibrate. If he relaxed, he became part of the background. The listener hissed, frustrated. It scrambled along the branch, its claws digging into the wood with a soft scritch-scritch. It moved away, jumping to the next tree, followed by its two companions. They were looking for movement. They were looking for noise. Since the noise had stopped, they returned to their patrol, crawling along the canopy like spiders. Bastian opened his eyes. He had not been eaten, but the fear had changed him. Before, he was trying to be careful. Now, he understood the stakes. He looked at the path ahead. It wound through a ravine, filled with dry brambles. To cross it as a normal cat was impossible. He would snag his fur. He would snap 1,000 twigs. He remembered the king's words, "In the day, you are small." Here, power is not measured by muscle, but by will. Bastian looked at his paws. He closed his eyes and imagined them dissolving. He imagined that he was not made of bone and blood. He imagined he was made of ink. He imagined that he was a cloud of black smoke, just like the king. "I have no weight," he recited in his mind. "I am not here. I am the space between the atoms." He opened his eyes. He lifted his paw again. This time, when he moved, he didn't just step. He flowed. He stepped onto a dry leaf. He braced for the crunch. But the leaf did not break. His paw pressed down, but it exerted no pressure. It was as if he were walking on the surface tension of water. He looked back. The leaf was intact. A thrill of discovery shot through him. He wasn't just walking quietly. He was beginning to unlearn the laws of gravity. He took another step, faster this time. Silence. He moved toward the brambles, not as a victim, but as a student who had just solved the first part of the riddle. The forest of echoes stretched out before him, miles of death traps and blind monsters. But Bastian smiled, revealing his sharp white teeth in the gloom. Let them listen. He was learning how to be a ghost. Bastian moved. But he no longer walked in the way a creature of flesh and bone walks. He had become a ripple in the air, a smudge of ink on a dark page. The brambles that should have snagged his fur seemed to pass right through him. Or perhaps he passed through them. It was a sensation of absolute liberation. For his entire life, Bastian had been defined by gravity, by the heaviness of his body, the ache in his joints, the demand of the earth pulling him down. Now, he felt weightless. He looked at a pile of dry twigs that blocked his path. In the old world, the gray world, this would have been an impassable wall of noise. To step on it would be to announce his presence to every predator for a mile. Bastian did not step on it. He stepped over it, his body elongating, stretching like a shadow at sunset, flowing over the obstacle with the fluidity of water running uphill. He was learning the language of the shadow. He realized that silence was not just the absence of sound. Silence was a presence. It was an energy you could wrap around yourself like a cloak. He moved deeper into the forest of echoes. The canopy above grew denser, the listeners in their cocoons more numerous. They hung like rotten fruit, their massive ears twitching, searching for the slightest vibration. But Bastian gave them nothing. He was a ghost in their machine. He glided past a listener, dangling inches from his face. He could smell the creature, a scent of sour milk and old dust. He could see the veins pulsing in its pale, translucent skin. The creature's ears swiveled toward him. It paused. It sensed something. A displacement of air, a change in temperature. But Bastian held his breath. He held his mind still. He became a void. The creature hissed, confused, and turned away. Bastian did not exhale until he was 10 paces clear. A thrill of power surged through him. For a small cat who had spent his life running from boots and brooms, this was intoxicating. He was invisible. He was untouchable. But the forest had one final test. The trees began to thin, giving way to a vast open cavern. At the far end of the cavern stood the exit, a silver archway glowing with the soft light of the Citadel. But blocking the path was the guardian. It was not a listener. It was something older. It was a great owl, but of a size that defied logic. It sat perched on a dead stump, its body a mass of ragged gray feathers that looked like stone. It had no eyes. Its face was a flat disk of white feathers, a perfect satellite dish designed to capture the sound of a moth flapping its wings a mile away. But this guardian did not hunt by the sound of footsteps. It hunted by the sound of life itself. As Bastian approached, stopping 20 yards away, the great owl turned its head. It didn't snap or hiss. It simply leaned forward, thump, thump. Bastian felt his own heart hammer against his ribs. The adrenaline of the sight had spiked his pulse. The owl's head jerked a fraction of an inch to the left. It had heard it. It had heard the rhythm of his blood pumping. Bastian froze. He understood the cruelty of the test. He could silence his pause. He could silence his breath. But how could he silence the engine of his own life? The owl opened its beak. It let out a low, vibrating screech that wasn't a sound, but a wave of pressure. It was a warning. I hear you living. Come closer, and you die. Bastian looked at the silver archway. It was so close. He looked at the owl. He closed his eyes. He remembered the feeling of the bath of starlight, the feeling of the cold London rain. The king had said, "To rule the night, you must become the night." Does the night have a heartbeat? No. The night is stillness. The night is the pause between breaths. Bastian focused on his chest. He visualized his heart not as a drum, but as a pendulum, swinging in oil, slow, heavy, silent. Slow down, he commanded his own biology. He imagined the cold of the universe entering his veins, not the biting cold of winter, but the peaceful, preserving cold of deep space. Thump, thump. His heart rate dropped. Thump, thump. He sank into a state of semi-hibernation, a trance known only to the masters of the deep sleep. His breathing became so shallow it barely moved his whiskers. His body temperature lowered, matching the ambient air of the cavern. He opened his eyes. They were no longer panicked. They were glassy and calm. He began to move. He did not run. Running requires blood. Running requires oxygen. He drifted. He walked toward the great owl. The guardian's head swiveled frantically. It twisted left, then right. It let out a frustrated click. It had lost the rhythm. The heartbeat had vanished. Bastian walked directly into the owl's kill zone. He passed right under the massive, razor-sharp talons. He looked up. He could see the texture of the guardian's claws. The owl remained frozen, waiting for a sound that never came. Bastian was not dead, but he was no longer fully alive in the way the prey is alive. He was something else. He was a phantom. He reached the silver archway. He stepped through the curtain of light. Instantly, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest vanished. The smell of dry rot was replaced by the clean scent of ozone and moonstone. Bastian stumbled. The trance broke. His heart hammered against his ribs. Thump, 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 thump. Gasps of air rushing into his lungs as his body demanded payment for the oxygen debt. He collapsed onto the smooth, cool floor of the Citadel, panting. He lay there for a long time, letting the world stop spinning. "You are louder than you think," a voice rumbled nearby. Bastian lifted his head. The ancient king was waiting for him, sitting by a fountain of black water. He looked pleased. I passed," Bastian wheezed, his voice ragged. "You did not just pass," the king corrected. "You evolved." Bastian stood up. He felt different. He looked at his paws. They seemed sharper, more defined. He took a step toward the king. There was no sound. Before, he walked quietly because he was trying. Now, silence was his default state. He struck the ground, but the ground refused to echo. He had rewritten his relationship with the physical world. "The forest takes your noise," the king said, standing up. "It keeps it. And in return, it gives you the shadow step. You will never again startle a mouse, nor wake a sleeping child, unless you wish to." The king turned toward a dark corridor that spiraled downward, deep into the roots of the floating continent. "You have mastered the body, Bastian. You have learned to walk as a ghost." The king's eyes grew solemn, the nebulas within them swirling with a dark purple hue. "Now, we must master the mind. The next trial is not about what you can do. It is about what you are willing to lose." Bastian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What comes next?" he asked. "The lake of memory," the king whispered, "where the past goes to drown. Come, the water is waiting." Chapter 4. The Price of Memory. They descended. The path led away from the high, glittering spires of the Citadel, winding down through tunnels carved from ancient, silent bedrock. The air here was different. It did not smell of ozone or starlight. It smelled of dust, dried flowers, and things long forgotten in attics. It was the scent of nostalgia, sweet, heavy, and suffocating. Bastian followed the ancient king. His new walk, the shadow step, made him feel weightless. But as they went deeper, his heart began to feel heavy. A strange lethargy pulled at his limbs. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was an emotional drag, like walking through water. "Be careful where you step," the king's voice echoed softly in the tunnel. "We are entering the cavern of yesterday. The air here is thick with regret. Breathe too deeply, and you may forget why you kept moving forward." The tunnel opened into a vast spherical chamber. There was no ceiling, only a swirling mist of sepia and gray fog that drifted endlessly. In the center of the chamber lay the lake. It was perfectly circular, its surface smooth as a sheet of black glass. There was not a single ripple. It was so still that it looked like a hole cut into the fabric of reality. Along the shores of the lake, strange white flowers grew. They had no leaves, only pale petals that glowed with a ghostly luminescence. "The lake of memory," the king whispered. "It contains everything that has ever been lost. Every toy a child dropped, every letter that was never sent, every goodbye that was never said." Bastian approached the edge. He felt a magnetic pull. The water didn't look like water. It looked like a window looking down into another room. "Look," the king commanded gently, "but do not touch. And whatever you do, do not try to enter. The past is a painting, Bastian. If you try to live in it, you become paint." Bastian crept to the shoreline. He peered over the edge. At first, he saw only his own reflection, the sleek, powerful black cat with the intelligent green eyes. The Prince of Night he was becoming. But as he stared, the reflection dissolved. The black water swirled and cleared, revealing a scene in technicolor clarity. Bastian's breath caught in his throat. He saw a room. It was warm. A fire crackled in a hearth surrounded by brass fenders. On the floor lay a Persian rug, deep red, patterned with intricate swirls, and sitting in a velvet armchair was her, the old woman, Auntie. She looked exactly as Bastian remembered, before the nephew, before the sickness, before the fear. She was knitting, the needles clicking in a soothing rhythm, and there, curled up on the rug by her feet, was a small, scrawny black cat. It was Bastian, the old Bastian. "I remember," Bastian whispered, his voice trembling. The vision was sensory. He could suddenly smell the lavender water she used on her clothes. He could feel the radiant heat of the fire on his fur. He could hear the hum of the kettle in the kitchen. In the water, the old woman stopped knitting. She looked down at the cat on the rug and smiled. Her eyes were full of love. "Who is my handsome boy?" Her lips moved, though the sound was muffled by the water. "Who is my little shadow?" Bastian felt a physical ache in his chest, sharp enough to cut breath. It was a yearning so powerful it made his knees weak. He wanted to be there. He wanted to jump into the water, swim down through the dark, and emerge back on that rug. He wanted to be a pet again. He wanted to be safe. He wanted to be loved by someone who didn't require him to walk through forests of monsters. "It is beautiful, isn't it?" the king asked sadly. "It is home," Bastian replied, leaning closer to the surface. His whiskers brushed the water. "It is a cage," the king corrected. Bastian's ears flattened. "How can it be a cage? She loved me. I was happy." "You were content," the king said. "But look closer, Bastian. Look at the edges of the room." Bastian looked. At the edges of the vision, the room was fraying. The windows were dark. The door was locked. "That moment is dead," the king said firmly. "It exists only in the reflection. If you go back to it, you do not go back to life. You go back to a memory. You will be trapped in that room, repeating that same hour of warmth forever, while the real world moves on without you. You will be a ghost, haunting a timeline that no longer exists." Bastian watched the scene in the water. The old woman reached down to pet the cat. He leaned further. He could almost feel her hand. "Why are you showing me this?" Bastian asked, tears gathering in his eyes. "To torture me?" "To ask you a question," the king said. The Ancient One sat down beside him, his massive presence anchoring Bastian to the present. "To rule the night, you must protect the sleepers. But the sleepers are often trapped by their own pasts. They lie in bed and replay their mistakes. They replay their losses. They drown in nostalgia." The king looked at the water. "You cannot save them if you are drowning too. You must decide, Bastian." "Decide what?" "Who you are," the king said. "Are you the stray who wants to go back to the rug? Or are you the king who will guard the dark so that others may find peace?" The king paused. "You cannot be both. The crown is heavy, Bastian. It requires both hands. You cannot hold the crown if you are still holding on to the past." Bastian looked at the water again. The fire was so warm. The old woman's face was so kind. It would be so easy. Just a slip. Just a fall. He could close his eyes and wake up on the rug, and the cold London rain, the scary forest, and the heavy responsibility of the kingdom would all be a bad dream. He extended a paw toward the water. The surface tension rippled. The image of the old woman seemed to look up at him. She beckoned. Bastian's heart hammered. The temptation was not evil. It was comfort. And comfort is the hardest thing to walk away from. "If I leave this behind," Bastian whispered, "will I forget her?" "No," the king said softly. "You will never forget. But it will stop hurting. it will turn from a wound into a scar, and eventually into a story. Bastian froze. He looked at the small cat on the rug. That cat was innocent. That cat knew nothing of the world. Bastian was not that cat anymore. He had walked the forest of echoes. He had seen the threads of souls. He slowly pulled his paw back. He stood up. He looked at the vision one last time, the only mother he had ever known. "Goodbye," he whispered. He turned his back on the lake. As he turned, a sound echoed through the cavern, the sound of glass breaking. Behind him, the surface of the lake shattered. The vision of the room dissolved into ripples of black water. The warmth vanished, replaced by the cool, stale air of the cavern. Bastian shivered, but he did not look back. "You chose the hard path," the king said, standing up with a nod of immense respect. "You broke the mirror." "It hurts," Bastian admitted, his voice hollow. "I know," the king said. "That is the price. A king sacrifices his own comfort so his people can sleep soundly." The king gestured to the far side of the cavern, where a dark, jagged tunnel led downwards into absolute blackness. "You have mastered the body in the forest. You have mastered the heart in the lake." The king's eyes stopped glowing. They became serious, dark voids. "Now, we go to the deep, to the forges, where the crown waits, and where the enemy is already knocking." The sound of the shattering lake did not fade. It lingered in the cavern, a high-pitched ringing that vibrated in Bastian's teeth. The beautiful image of the warm room, the fire, and the old woman was gone. In its place, the black water churned violently, roiling like a sea in a storm, swallowing the fragments of the memory back into its depths. Bastian stood trembling on the shore. He had done it. He had chosen the cold reality of his duty over the warm seduction of the past. But victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like amputation. He felt a phantom warmth on his fur where the fire should have been, a ghost sensation that made the damp air of the cave feel freezing by comparison. He let out a small, involuntary whimper. It was the sound of a kitten looking for its mother. The ancient king did not rush him. He did not offer empty platitudes. He sat immovable as a mountain, letting Bastian process the grief. "It is quiet now," Bastian whispered, his voice thick with loss. "The memory, it was loud. It was full of life. Now there is only silence." "That is the nature of growth," the king said gently. "Childhood is loud. Kingship is silent." The king rose slowly, his joints clicking in the damp air. He moved closer to Bastian, not to comfort him with touch, but to offer his presence as a shield against the dark. "You are bleeding, little watcher." Bastian looked down at his paws. They were unharmed. "Not your body," the king corrected, tapping his own chest. "Your spirit. You tore a piece of yourself away just now. That leaves a wound." The king's galaxy eyes swirled with a somber violet hue. "Do not try to close it. Do not try to pretend it does not hurt. A king who cannot feel his own pain will never feel the pain of his subjects. Let it bleed. Let it remind you of what you gave up to be here." Bastian took a deep, shuddering breath. He inhaled the scent of the dead white flowers that grew by the lake. "Does it ever go away?" Bastian asked. "The wish to go back?" "No," the king answered truthfully. "Sometimes, on the longest nights, when the burden of the crown is heavy, you will look back at that rug and wish you were just a pet. You will wish for the bowl of milk and the ignorance of the window." The king turned his massive head toward the dark tunnel that led deeper into the earth. "But then you will remember the threads. You will remember the millions of souls who are sleeping, undefended in the dark, and you will realize that their safety is worth your sorrow. The water in the lake began to settle. The black glass smoothed over, but it no longer showed reflections. It was opaque. Dead. You have passed the trial of the heart, the king declared. Most who come here dive into the water. They drown in their own nostalgia. They become the spirits that haunt old houses, refusing to move on. You stayed on the shore. The king's tone shifted. It became harder, sharper. The sadness evaporated, replaced by the urgency of a general at war. But grief is a luxury we no longer have, Bastian. Look. The king pointed a claw toward the far end of the cavern. There, the shadows were not behaving correctly. In the corners of the room, the darkness was eating the rock. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was a physical erosion. The stone was dissolving into a gray, powdery dust. Do you smell it? The king asked. Bastian sniffed. Underneath the smell of the lake and the dust, there was something else. A scent that made his hackles rise and his claws extend involuntarily. It smelled like rust, like ozone, like the static of a dead channel on a radio. It smells empty, Bastian said, struggling for the word. The void, the king confirmed. The Devorador de Luas. It is leaking into the foundations of the castle. The king began to walk toward the exit of the cavern, his pace faster now. While we dallied with your memories, the enemy has been gnawing at our roots. The lake is disturbed not just by your choice, but by the tremors from below. Bastian shook his head, physically shaking off the last tendrils of the vision of the old woman. He sharpened his eyes. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in his gut, but he pushed it down. He trotted to catch up with the king. What is down there? Bastian asked, looking at the ominous tunnel mouth. The deep, the king said. The subconscious. It is the boiler room of the Night Kingdom. It is where the raw materials of dreams are mined. The king paused at the threshold of the tunnel. He looked back at Bastian. You have the stealth of the forest. You have the resolve of the lake. Now you will need something else. What? Courage, the king said simply. Because in the deep, the shadows do not just hide things. They have teeth. Bastian looked into the tunnel. It was pitch black. No bioluminescence, no starlight. Just a throat of stone leading down into the center of the world. He thought of the rug one last time. It seemed very far away now, a lifetime away. He looked at the king. Lead the way, Bastian said, and together they stepped into the abyss. The tunnel that led away from the lake of memory was not man-made, nor was it carved by the claws of the high spirits. It was a natural artery of the floating continent, a throat of stone that spiraled down into the very core of the Night Kingdom. Bastian followed the ancient king into the gloom. Behind them, the faint sepia light of the lake faded, until it was swallowed by the bend in the path. Now there was only darkness. But for Bastian, who had bathed in starlight and mastered the forest of echoes, darkness was no longer a blindfold. It was a texture. He could see the walls of the tunnel. They were made of sedimentary rock layers, strata of compressed dreams and fossilized wishes. He saw veins of silver ore, pulsating faintly, like slow, dying heartbeats in the stone. The descent was steep. Bastian had to use his claws to control his slide on the smooth slate floor. Down, down, down. The air grew heavier with every 100 feet. It pressed against his eardrums. It tasted metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. We are going very deep, Bastian noted, his voice sounding small in the confined space. We are going to the roots, the king replied, his voice vibrating through the floor. Most of the kingdom lives in the spires, up in the starlight. But the foundation of the night is here, in the dark. Bastian trotted to keep pace with the king's long, fluid strides. You spoke of the enemy, Bastian said, the void. You said it was different from the night. But isn't it all just darkness? The king stopped. He turned his massive head. In the absolute pitch black of the tunnel, the galaxies in his eyes were the only source of illumination, casting long, rotating shadows against the walls. That is the mistake the humans make, the king rumbled, and it is a dangerous one. The king lifted a paw and touched the darkness of the tunnel. The night is a presence, Bastian. It is full. It is the sound of crickets. It is the smell of rain. It is the feeling of a heavy blanket. The night is alive. The king withdrew his paw. The void is the absence. It is not silence. It is deafness. It is not the dark. It is blindness. It is the space where things used to be. The king looked deep into Bastian's green eyes. The night allows you to rest, so you can wake up tomorrow. The void does not want you to wake up. It is entropy. It is the end of the story. Bastian shivered. The distinction settled in his gut like a shard of ice. He realized why the smell in the cavern above had terrified him. It wasn't the smell of a predator. It was the smell of nothing. And it is here? Bastian asked. Inside the castle? It is scratching at the door, the king admitted gravely. The void is always hungry. And as my power fades, the walls between existence and non-existence are getting thin. They continued their descent. The architecture of the tunnel began to change. The rough stone gave way to something structured. Bastian saw enormous arches towering above them, built from blocks of black basalt, so large they must have been placed by giants. They were entering the Undercity. But something was wrong. Bastian's new senses, the ones honed in the forest, were screaming at him. It's quiet, Bastian whispered. Too quiet. The deep mines are usually full of the sound of work, the king said, his pace quickening. The moles, the badgers, the blind worms, they should be singing the song of the earth. But there was no song. There was only the damp drip, drip, drip of condensation. They rounded a final corner and stood before a massive pair of doors. They were the gates of the deep. They were made of iron and bone, etched with protective runes that glowed with a faint, dying amber light. But the gates were not closed. One of the doors hung slightly ajar, crooked on its hinges. Deep claw marks, 4 distinct gouges, were torn into the metal. The iron was not bent, it was dissolved, eaten away as if by acid. Bastian smelled it again, the scent of ozone, the scent of static. The door is breached, Bastian hissed, his fur standing on end. The ancient king approached the gate slowly. He sniffed the damaged metal. For the first time since they met in the London alley, Bastian saw an emotion on the king's face that terrified him more than any monster. Uncertainty. This damage is fresh, the king murmured. Hours old. He turned to Bastian. I thought we had time. I thought I could train you in the forges, let you find your own armor. The king looked at the dark crack in the door, leading into the silence beyond. But the war has already begun. Bastian stepped up beside the king. He looked at his own shadow. It looked small against the massive gates. I am ready, Bastian lied. He didn't feel ready. He felt tiny. No, the king said softly. You are not. But you are here. And sometimes that is the only qualification that matters. The king nudged the heavy iron door with his shoulder. It groaned, a screech of tortured metal. that echoed down into the abyss. The way forward was open, the deep awaited, and inside it, something was waiting for them. Chapter 5. The Descent into the Abyss. They stepped through the broken iron gates and into the throat of the world. If the citadel above was a place of light and crystal, the deep was a place of weight and stone. The air here was old. It had been breathed 1,000 times by the earth itself before it ever reached a pair of longsons. It was thick, humid, and smelled of wet clay and iron filings. Bastian kept close to the ancient king. His shadow step allowed him to move without sound, but the silence of the deep was so absolute that he could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. This was not the peaceful silence of a library. It was the silence of a clock that had stopped ticking. They entered a vast cavern that stretched out into the darkness, like the nave of a ruined cathedral. Enormous pillars of rough-cut basalt rose up to support a ceiling lost in the gloom. "This is the Hall of Roots," the king whispered, his voice low and rumbling. "Usually this place is deafening. The moles sing as they dig. The badgers strike the stone with hammers of star metal. The echoes carry the song of creation up to the surface." The king paused, turning his head slowly to scan the shadows. But tonight, the song is dead. Bastian looked around. His eyes, adjusted to the dark, began to pick out shapes in the gloom. Scattered across the floor were tools. Pickaxes made of silver, hammers made of meteor iron. Wheelbarrows overturned, spilling raw, glowing gemstones onto the dusty floor. It looked as though the workers had simply dropped everything and vanished. "Where are they?" Bastian asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "They are here," the king said. He walked toward a pile of rubble near one of the great pillars. Bastian followed. As they drew closer, Bastian saw a shape huddled against the stone. It was a giant mole, a creature the size of a bear, with fur like velvet and massive shovel-like claws. It was sitting upright, frozen in a posture of cowering fear. Its hands were raised to cover its face. Is it sleeping?" Bastian whispered. The king did not answer. He reached out a paw and gently touched the mole's shoulder. The moment the king made contact, the figure did not wake. It did not move. It collapsed. But it didn't fall like a body. It crumbled. The mole dissolved into a pile of fine gray dust, like ash from a fire that burned out long ago. Bastian jumped back, his fur puffing up in horror. What happened to him? Bastian gasped. He was not killed, the king said, his voice heavy with ancient anger. He was unmade. The king looked at the pile of gray ash. The void does not kill, Bastian. Death is a natural part of the night. Death is a transition. What the void does is erasure. It steals the history of the thing. It steals the idea of the thing. The king looked around the silent hall. All of them. The workers. The singers. They haven't gone to the afterlife. They have simply ceased to have ever been. Bastian looked at the vast, empty cavern with new eyes. It wasn't an abandoned mine. It was a graveyard of existence. He felt a terror he had never known in the streets of London. In London, he feared pain. He feared hunger. Here, he feared nothingness. He looked at his own paws. For a second, he terrified himself with the thought, if the void touches me, will anyone remember I was here? Will the rug and the fire and the old woman disappear from history too? We must keep moving, the king said, breaking Bastian's spiral of fear. The void leaves a trail. It seeks the hottest fires to consume. It will be heading for the Star Forge. The forge? Where the crown is made, the king said, and where the core of the kingdom burns. If the void eats the core, the night will collapse. The humans will never sleep again. They will be trapped in an eternal waking madness. They moved deeper into the cavern, threading their way through the maze of abandoned tools and piles of gray dust. The environment began to change. The rough stone walls gave way to architecture that looked organic, like the inside of a rib cage. And then Bastian smelled it again. Ozone. Static. But this time it was stronger. It tasted like licking a battery. "King," Bastian whispered, "look." He pointed to the wall on their left. The basalt stone was marred by a long, jagged scar, but it wasn't a scratch. It was a patch of absolute blackness. It looked like someone had taken a paintbrush, dipped in absence, and painted over reality. The rock wasn't just dark, it was gone. Bastian stared at it. The anomaly seemed to vibrate. It hurt his eyes to focus on it. "Do not stare at the scars," the king warned, nudging Bastian forward. "The void is a contagion. If you look too long, it looks back." They hurried past the scar. Ahead, a reddish glow began to bleed into the darkness. Heat, real, physical heat, wafted toward them. "The forge is near," the king said. But just as he spoke, a sound echoed from the darkness ahead. It was not the sound of a hammer. It was a sound like wet canvas tearing. Screet! And then, a voice. Not a voice of a beast, or a cat, or a man. A voice that sounded like many voices screaming at once, layered over each other, distorted and glitching. "Hungry?" the voice echoed, bouncing off the walls. "So." "Bright?" "So." "Empty." Bastian froze. He dropped into a crouch, engaging his shadow step. The king stopped. His galaxy eyes narrowed. "It is guarding the bridge," the king whispered. "The Devorador?" Bastian asked. "No," the king said. "Something smaller, a scout, a hollow one." The king looked down at Bastian. "I am too large to approach without being seen. My light is too bright. It will sense me." The king paused, a terrible weight in his gaze. "You must go ahead, Bastian. You must use the silence. Scout the bridge. Find out what stands between us and the fire." Bastian looked at the red glow ahead. He looked at the shadows dancing on the walls, shadows that looked jagged and wrong. He swallowed hard. He was a king in training, but right now he felt very much like a small cat in a very big, very dark hole. "I will look," Bastian whispered. "Go," the king said. "Be a ghost." Bastian slipped forward, leaving the safety of the king's side. He melted into the dark, creeping toward the red light, and the terrible tearing sound of the thing that waited in the dark. Bastian moved away from the ancient king, and with every step, the comforting gravity of the massive star cat faded, replaced by a suffocating isolation. He was alone again. Just a small black cat in a world that was too big, too hot, and too quiet. He engaged the shadow step. He visualized his body becoming smoke. He felt the familiar sensation of weightlessness as his paws touched the ground without impact. The tunnel opened up into a colossal cavern, lit by a deep, angry crimson glow. In the center of the cavern lay a chasm. Far below, a river of molten star metal flowed like thick golden lava. It was the bloodstream of the kingdom, the raw material of dreams. Spanning the chasm was a bridge made of black iron chains and obsidian planks. And standing in the middle of that bridge was the thing. Bastian crouched behind a stalagmite, his tail tucked tight, his green eyes wide with a terror that was hard to comprehend. The king had called it a hollow one. Bastian looked at it, and his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It was vaguely shaped like a hound, but it had no fur, no skin, and no muscles. It looked like a sketch drawn by a madman on reality and then violently erased. Its body was a flickering silhouette of static, jagged lines of white noise and absolute darkness, constantly shifting, glitching, and tearing. Where its head should be, there was no face, just a swirling vortex of gray dust. It didn't walk. It twitched forward, phasing in and out of existence with that terrible sound Bastian had heard earlier. Screet. The sound of a wet canvas tearing. The hollow one was sniffing the air. But it wasn't smelling for scent. It was smelling for existence. It was looking for things that were whole, so it could break them. Bastian watched, paralyzed, as the creature turned toward one of the massive iron chains holding the bridge. The creature opened its mouth, a jagged tear in the static, and bit down on the metal. There was no crunch. The iron chain didn't break. It simply stopped. A section of the heavy link turned gray, then white, and then dissolved into powder. The bridge groaned, sagging dangerously as one of its supports vanished. It is eating the path, Bastian realized. If it eats the bridge, we cannot reach the forge. The core will fall. Bastian knew he had to act. He had to clear the way for the king. But how? He was the size of a loaf of bread. That thing was the size of a carriage horse. He looked around. The heat from the magma below was intense, making the air shimmer. To his left, near the edge of the cliff, sat a pile of discarded mining tools, a metal bucket, a pickaxe, and several large rocks. An idea formed in Bastian's mind. A dangerous, foolish idea. The king had taught him to be silent. But sometimes, to control the dark, you have to make noise. Bastian crept toward the pile of tools. He moved like oil, flowing over the uneven ground. The hollow one was busy gnawing on another chain. Screet. The bridge shuddered again. Bastian reached the pile. He looked at the metal bucket. It was sitting precariously on a ledge of rock, overlooking the chasm, but away from the bridge. If he could knock it over, it would tumble down the cliff, hitting the rocks on the way down. It would be loud. It would draw the monster away from the bridge. But it would also tell the monster that something was here. Bastian positioned himself behind the bucket. He looked at the glitching horror on the bridge. Do it, he told himself. For the old woman, for the rug, for the sleeping world. Bastian reared up on his hind legs. He placed his front paws on the cold metal of the bucket. He pushed. Clang. The bucket tipped. It hit the stone ledge with a sharp, ringing note that cut through the silence like a knife. Clatter, bang, crash. The bucket tumbled down the cliffside, striking outcroppings, creating a cacophony of echoes that bounced around the cavern. On the bridge, the hollow one whipped around. Its face vortex swirled violently. Screech! It let out a digital scream that made Bastian's teeth ache. The monster abandoned the chain. It moved with terrifying speed, twitching and glitching across the bridge, rushing toward the source of the sound. It leaped off the bridge, landing on the cliff edge where the bucket had fallen, its claws tearing gouges into the rock. It stared down into the darkness of the chasm, watching the bucket fall toward the magma. Bastian was pressed flat against the ground, hidden behind a rock only 10 feet away. He stopped his heart. Thump, thump. Silence. He became a stone. He became a shadow. The hollow one was so close Bastian could feel the cold radiating from it. A dry, freezing vacuum that sucked the heat out of the air. The creature scanned the area. Its head twitched. Left. Right. It was looking for the life that had pushed the bucket. Bastian didn't blink. He didn't breathe. The monster hissed, a sound of static interference. It couldn't find him. To its senses, the ledge was empty. Confused and angry, the creature turned its back on Bastian and began to prowl down the edge of the cliff, away from the bridge, following the echo of the falling bucket. The path was clear. Bastian exhaled, a tiny puff of air. He turned and sprinted, silently, back toward the tunnel entrance. King. Bastian projected his thought as he ran. Now, the bridge is clear. From the darkness of the tunnel, a massive shape emerged. The ancient king did not sneak. He did not hide. He erupted into the cavern like a supernova. His fur blazed with the light of 1 billion stars. His eyes were twin suns. The king roared, a sound that shook the stalactites from the ceiling. "Leave this place, abomination!" The hollow one spun around, shrieking. It saw the king, a massive source of light and existence, the ultimate meal. The monster lunged, abandoning its search for the small cat and charging toward the great one. But the king was ready. He opened his mouth and unleashed a beam of pure, white starlight. The beam hit the hollow one midair. There was no explosion. The light simply filled the void. The creature shrieked as its static form was overwhelmed by the density of the king's reality. It thrashed, trying to eat the light, but there was too much of it. With a final, dissolving wail, the hollow one burst apart, scattering into harmless gray dust that rained down into the magma below. Silence returned to the cavern. The king stood panting, his light dimming slightly. He looked tired. Using that much power had cost him. Bastian ran to his side. "You did it?" Bastian said, awestruck. "We did it," the king corrected, looking down at Bastian with pride. "You moved the piece so I could take the board. That is how a king thinks." The king looked at the bridge. It was damaged, sagging on one side, but still passable. "The way is open," the king said. But that was only a scout. If a hollow one was here, then the forge is already under siege. He looked at the red glow on the other side of the chasm. "Come, Bastian. The heart of the world is bleeding. We must cauterize the wound." They stepped onto the swaying, damaged bridge. Below them, the gold magma churned. Ahead of them, the red light pulsed like a fever. Bastian walked carefully, avoiding the gaps where the chains had been eaten. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was focused. He had tricked a demon. He had saved the path. He was no longer just a stray. He was the king's shadow. Bastian moved away from the ancient king, and with every step, the comforting gravity of the massive starcat faded, replaced by a suffocating isolation. He was alone again, just a small black cat in a world that was too big, too hot, and too quiet. He engaged the shadow step. He visualized his body becoming smoke. He felt the familiar sensation of weightlessness as his paws touched the ground without impact. The tunnel opened up into a colossal cavern, lit by a deep, angry crimson glow. In the center of the cavern lay a chasm. Far below, a river of molten star metal flowed like thick golden lava. It was the bloodstream of the kingdom, the raw material of dreams. Spanning the chasm was a bridge made of black iron chains and obsidian planks, and standing in the middle of that bridge was the thing. Bastian crouched behind a stalagmite, his tail tucked tight, his green eyes wide with a terror that was hard to comprehend. The king had called it a hollow one. Bastian looked at it, and his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It was vaguely shaped like a hound, but it had no fur, no skin, and no muscles. It looked like a sketch drawn by a madman on reality and then violently erased. Its body was a flickering silhouette of static, jagged lines of white noise, and absolute darkness, constantly shifting, glitching, and tearing. Where its head should be, there was no face, just a swirling vortex of gray dust. It didn't walk. It twitched forward, phasing in and out of existence, with that terrible sound Bastian had heard earlier. Screet. The sound of a wet canvas tearing. The hollow one was sniffing the air, but it wasn't smelling for scent. It was smelling for existence. It was looking for things that were whole, so it could break them. Bastian watched, paralyzed, as the creature turned toward one of the massive iron chains holding the bridge. The creature opened its mouth, a jagged tear in the static, and bit down on the metal. There was no crunch. The iron chain didn't break. It simply stopped. A section of the heavy link turned gray, then white, and then dissolved into powder. The bridge groaned, sagging dangerously as one of its supports vanished. It is eating the path, Bastian realized. If it eats the bridge, we cannot reach the forge. The core will fall. Bastian knew he had to act. He had to clear the way for the king, but how? He was the size of a loaf of bread. That thing was the size of a carriage horse. He looked around. The heat from the magma below was intense, making the air shimmer. To his left, near the edge of the cliff, sat a pile of discarded mining tools. A metal bucket, a pickaxe, and several large rocks. An idea formed in Bastian's mind. A dangerous, foolish idea. The king had taught him to be silent, but sometimes, to control the dark, you have to make noise. Bastian crept toward the pile of tools. He moved like oil, flowing over the uneven ground. The hollow one was busy gnawing on another chain. Screet! The bridge shuddered again. Bastian reached the pile. He looked at the metal bucket. It was sitting precariously on a ledge of rock, overlooking the chasm, but away from the bridge. If he could knock it over, it would tumble down the cliff, hitting the rocks on the way down. It would be loud. It would draw the monster away from the bridge. But it would also tell the monster that something was here. Bastian positioned himself behind the bucket. He looked at the glitching horror on the bridge. Do it, he told himself. For the old woman. For the rug. For the sleeping world. Bastian reared up on his hind legs. He placed his front paws on the cold metal of the bucket. He pushed. Clang. The bucket tipped. It hit the stone ledge with a sharp, ringing note that cut through the silence like a knife. Clatter, bang, crash. The bucket tumbled down the cliffside, striking outcroppings, creating a cacophony of echoes that bounced around the cavern. On the bridge, the hollow one whipped around. Its face vortex swirled violently. Screech! It let out a digital scream that made Bastian's teeth ache. The monster abandoned the chain. It moved with terrifying speed, twitching and glitching across the bridge, rushing toward the source of the sound. It leaped off the bridge, landing on the cliff edge where the bucket had fallen, its claws tearing gouges into the rock. It stared down into the darkness of the chasm, watching the bucket fall toward the magma. Bastian was pressed flat against the ground, hidden behind a rock only 10 feet away. He stopped his heart. Thump, thump, silence. He became a stone. He became a shadow. The hollow one was so close, Bastian could feel the cold radiating from it, a dry, freezing vacuum that sucked the heat out of the air. The creature scanned the area. Its head twitched left, right. It was looking for the life that had pushed the bucket. Bastian didn't blink. He didn't breathe. The monster hissed, a sound of static interference. It couldn't find him. To its senses, the ledge was empty. Confused and angry, the creature turned its back on Bastian and began to prowl down the edge of the cliff, away from the bridge, following the echo of the falling bucket. The path was clear. Bastian exhaled, a tiny puff of air. He turned and sprinted, silently, back toward the tunnel entrance. King! Bastian projected his thought as he ran. Now! The bridge is clear. From the darkness of the tunnel, a massive shape emerged. The ancient king did not sneak. He did not hide. He erupted into the cavern like a supernova. His fur blazed with the light of 1 billion stars. His eyes were twin suns. The king roared, a sound that shook the stalactites from the ceiling. "Leave this place, abomination." The Hollow One spun around, shrieking. It saw the king, a massive source of light and existence, the ultimate meal. The monster lunged, abandoning its search for the small cat and charging toward the Great One. But the king was ready. He opened his mouth and unleashed a beam of pure white starlight. The beam hit the Hollow One midair. There was no explosion. The light simply filled the void. The creature shrieked as its static form was overwhelmed by the density of the king's reality. It thrashed, trying to eat the light, but there was too much of it. With a final, dissolving wail, the Hollow One burst apart, scattering into harmless gray dust that rained down into the magma below. Silence returned to the cavern. The king stood panting, his light dimming slightly. He looked tired. Using that much power had cost him. Bastian ran to his side. "You did it," Bastian said, awestruck. "We did it," the king corrected, looking down at Bastian with pride. "You moved the piece so I could take the board. That is how a king thinks." The king looked at the bridge. It was damaged, sagging on one side, but still passable. "The way is open," the king said. But that was only a scout. If a Hollow One was here, then the forge is already under siege. He looked at the red glow on the other side of the chasm. "Come, Bastian. The heart of the world is bleeding. We must cauterize the wound." They stepped onto the swaying, damaged bridge. Below them, the gold magma churned. Ahead of them, the red light pulsed like a fever. Bastian walked carefully, avoiding the gaps where the chains had been eaten. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was focused. He had tricked a demon. He had saved the path. He was no longer just a stray. He was the king's shadow. Chapter 6. The Invasion. The heat on the other side of the bridge was not the dry, dusty heat of a desert. It was the heavy, crushing heat of a star's core. Bastian kept low, his belly brushing the warm obsidian floor. The air shimmered, distorting the architecture of the deep, making the massive pillars look like they were melting. They had reached the Star Forge. It was a cavern so vast it could have swallowed the entire city of London. In the center, suspended in midair by 4 colossal chains made of white-hot gravity, hung the core. It was a sphere of pure, pulsating energy, the heart of the Night Kingdom. Usually, the king had said, the core burned with a calm, silver-blue light, powering the dreams of the world above. But tonight, the core was sick. It pulsed with a feverish, erratic rhythm. Veins of charcoal-gray corruption were spreading across its surface, like mold growing on a fruit. Beneath the core stood the anvil of creation, a flat block of meteor iron where the crown was destined to be forged. "We are late," the ancient king rumbled. His voice sounded weak, stripped of its usual thunder. He walked toward the anvil, his steps heavy. The light in his own fur was dimming, syncing with the dying rhythm of the core. The infection has reached the heart. If the core turns gray, the night dies. The sun will never set again, and the world will burn in endless day. Bastian looked around the vast chamber. It felt abandoned, just like the mines. Where are the smiths? Bastian asked. Where are the guardians? Gone, the king said. Consumed. Suddenly, the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a heartbeat. A slow, thudding rhythm that came from everywhere. Thump. Thump. The shadows in the corners of the vast cavern began to move. Bastian watched in horror as the darkness detached itself from the walls. It pooled on the floor, sliding toward the center of the room like an oil spill moving uphill. From the pool of darkness, shapes began to rise. Not the small, twitching, hollow ones like the scout on the bridge. These were soldiers. Tall, faceless figures made of static and void. They held weapons, spears and swords, that were not made of metal, but of negative space. When they moved, they left trails of silence in the air. There were dozens of them, then hundreds. They formed a circle around the king and Bastian, cutting off the exit to the bridge. They were waiting for us, Bastian realized, his tail puffing up to twice its size. It was a trap. No, the king said softly, baring his teeth. It is a challenge. The king looked down at Bastian. Listen to me closely, little watcher. The shadow step will not save you here. There are too many eyes. The king stepped forward, placing his massive body between Bastian and the army of the void. I am going to buy you time. I will draw their fire. I will ignite the core one last time. What do I do? Bastian asked, his voice trembling. Run to the anvil, the king commanded. The crown is not a physical object you can find. It must be summoned. You must touch the anvil and claim your right. You must demand the night to recognize you. Screech! A collective shriek tore through the cavern. The army of the void charged. It was like watching a tidal wave of ink crash against a lighthouse. The ancient king roared. He did not fire a beam of light this time. He became light. He exploded into a supernova of brilliance, blindingly white. He leaped into the center of the approaching horde. It was a clash of titans. The king swiped his massive claws, and where they struck, the void soldiers dissolved into dust. He bit, and the static shattered. But there were too many of them. They swarmed over him, stabbing at his starlight fur with their dark spears. Every strike that landed dimmed the king's light a little more. Go, the king bellowed, his voice shaking the foundations of the cavern. Run, Bastian! Bastian broke from his cover. He sprinted across the open floor toward the anvil. A void soldier saw him. It broke away from the main fight, gliding across the floor with terrifying speed, raising a jagged spear to skewer the small cat. Bastian didn't stop. He didn't try to hide. He remembered the king's lesson. Empathy is your strength, but sometimes you need claws. Bastian didn't dodge. He jumped. He leaped straight at the faceless head of the soldier. He extended his claws, not the physical claws of a street cat, but the spectral claws he had sensed growing within him. He slashed. His claws cut through the static like a knife through smoke. The soldier shrieked and dissipated. Bastian landed and kept running. He scrambled up the side of the massive anvil. The stone was hot, burning his pads, but he didn't care. He reached the top. He looked back. The scene broke his heart. The ancient king was burying himself under a mountain of enemies. He was fighting with the ferocity of a dying star, but his light was fading rapidly. The violet galaxies in his eyes were going dark. The king looked up, meeting Bastian's gaze across the cavern. There was no fear in the king's eyes, only acceptance. I am the dusk, the king shouted. his voice echoing with finality. "My time is over." The king slammed his paws into the ground. A shockwave of energy knocked the Void Army back for a second. He looked at Bastian. "Be the dawn." And then the king did the unthinkable. He stopped fighting the soldiers. He turned and leaped upward, straight toward the corrupted, dying core suspended in the air. "No!" Bastian screamed. The ancient king collided with the core. He didn't attack it. He embraced it. He wrapped his massive body around the dying heart of the kingdom. He began to pour his own life force, his own starlight, directly into the infection. It was a transfusion of soul. The gray corruption on the core began to burn away, scorched by the king's sacrifice. The silver-blue light began to return, brighter and hotter than before. But as the core grew brighter, the king grew transparent. He was giving everything. He was burning himself out to reignite the engine of the night. The Void Army screeched in pain as the light from the core intensified, blinding them, burning their static forms. Bastian shielded his eyes. The light was too strong. "Goodbye, little watcher," the king's voice whispered in his mind, faint as a breeze. There was a flash of white, absolute silence, and then nothing. The king was gone. The core was stable, burning with a furious blue light. But Bastian was alone on the anvil, and the Void Army, though burned and reduced, was still there. And now they turned all their faceless heads toward him. The silence that followed the king's sacrifice was heavier than the stone ceiling above. Bastian stood alone on top of the anvil of creation. The spot where the ancient king had stood only moments ago was empty. There was no body, no fur, only a lingering, shimmering dust suspended in the air, slowly drifting down like snow. Bastian felt a scream rising in his throat, a cry of grief for the only being who had ever truly seen him. But the scream died before it reached his lips. There was no time to mourn. Below the anvil, the army of the void was recovering. The king's light had burned them, melting their static forms, blowing off limbs and erasing faces. But the void is relentless. It does not feel pain, it only feels hunger. Slowly, twitching and glitching, the soldiers began to reform. They turned their faceless heads toward the anvil, hundreds of them, a sea of jagged shadows and white noise, all focused on one small black cat. Screet! The sound began again. The sound of wet canvas tearing, the sound of reality being unwritten. They began to climb. They dug their claws of negative space into the sides of the anvil, swarming up like a tide of black insects. Bastian backed away to the center of the anvil. He was trapped. The bridge was too far. The tunnel was blocked. He looked at his own paws. They were small. He had killed one soldier, yes, but he could not kill an army. "I am not enough," he whispered to the empty air. He made a mistake. "I am just a stray." He looked up at the core. It was burning bright blue now, stabilized by the king's life force. It pulsed with a steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a heart waiting for a body. The crown is not a physical object. It must be summoned. The king's last command echoed in Bastian's mind. Bastian looked down at the surface of the anvil. It was a slab of meteorite iron, black and cold, etched with spirals that seemed to move if you looked at them too long. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like an altar. A claw appeared over the edge of the anvil, then another. A void soldier pulled itself up, its body flickering in and out of existence. It raised a spear made of silence. Bastian hissed, swiping at it. His spectral claws severed the soldier's arm, sending it tumbling back down, but two more took its place. Then 3. The circle was closing. Bastian realized he had seconds left. He turned his back on the monsters. He faced the center of the anvil. He closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't beg. He reached deep into that cold, hard place in his soul, the place that had survived the rain, the hunger, and the rejection. He placed his right paw firmly on the center of the anvil. "I am Bastian," he projected, his thought voice trembling, "and I claim this darkness." Nothing happened. The anvil remained cold. Behind him, the void soldiers hissed. They were crested the ledge. They were rushing toward him. "I said," Bastian shouted in his mind, digging his claws into the iron, "I claim it." The anvil woke up. It didn't glow. It pulled. Bastian felt a sudden violent yank, as if the gravity of the entire planet had shifted to the center of his paw. His mind was sucked into the stone. The cavern vanished. The monsters vanished. He was floating in a void of his own. But this wasn't the gray void of the enemy. This was the velvet void, the womb of the night. A voice spoke. It wasn't the king's voice. It was a chorus of millions of whispers, the voices of every creature that had ever ruled the dark. "Who are you?" The voices thundered. "Why do you wake the iron?" "I am the heir," Bastian answered. "Lineage?" The voices demanded. "Which blood do you carry? The lion? The panther? The tiger?" Bastian faltered. "None," he admitted. "I carry the blood of the gutter. I am of the line of nobody." The voices went silent. The judgment hung heavy in the dark. "Then you have no right," the voices boomed. "The crown is for kings." Bastian felt the rejection burning him. It felt just like the nephew kicking him out of the house. "No," Bastian thought. "Not this time." "You are wrong," Bastian projected back, with a fury that surprised even him. "The lion rules by strength," Bastian argued. "The tiger rules by fear. But the night is not about strength or fear. The night is about survival." He pushed his will against the ancient voices. "I have frozen. I have starved. I have been invisible. I know what it means to be a shadow better than any lion." He visualized the threads of the sleeping humans. He visualized the old woman. He visualized the sacrifice of the ancient king. "I do not claim the crown because I was born to it," Bastian declared. "I claim it because I am the only one left to hold it, and I will not let the lights go out." There was a pause. A long, terrified silence in the psychic realm. Then the anvil answered. "Accepted." The word hit Bastian like a physical blow. Pain exploded in his head. It was the pain of being reshaped. It felt like molten silver was being poured into his veins, replacing his blood with starlight. He screamed, but it was a silent scream. His body, on the physical plane, arched, his back bowing, his fur standing straight up. The core above him fired a beam of blue energy straight down. It hit Bastian. It didn't burn him. It forged him. Reality snaps back. Bastian opened his eyes. The void soldiers were inches away. A spear was descending toward his neck. Bastian caught the spear. He didn't use his paws. He used his will. The spear stopped in midair, frozen by an invisible force. The void soldier twitched, confused. Bastian stood up. He felt different. He felt heavy. Not with weight, but with gravity. He felt anchored to the center of the universe. He looked at the soldier. Bastian's eyes were no longer just green. In the center of his pupils, a blue star had ignited. A cold, piercing, electric turquoise light that shone like a lighthouse beam. And on his head, it wasn't a physical object. It was a manifestation of pure authority. A crown of jagged silvery starlight hovered inches above his ears. It swirled with smoke and nebulas. The crown of the Night King. Bastian didn't hiss. He didn't growl. He simply spoke, and his voice was no longer the small mewl of a cat. It was the voice of the tectonic plates grinding together. Kneel. The word hit the Void soldiers like a shock wave. The soldier holding the spear collapsed, its static form shuddering. The others froze, sensing the shift in power. The king was dead, but the king had returned. Bastian stepped forward, the silver crown blazing above his head. He looked at the army that had killed his mentor. He felt no fear. He felt only a cold, ancient anger. "You are in my house," Bastian whispered, "and I want you out." The cavern of the Starforge held its breath. The army of the Void, a legion of flickering static and malice, hesitated. They were creatures of entropy, designed to unravel existence, but in front of them stood something absolute. Bastian stood on the anvil. The jagged crown of silver starlight floating above his head was not just a decoration. It was a heavy, humming focus of power. It drew the energy from the core and channeled it through his small, black body. He felt the minds of the monsters pressing against his own. They felt like cold, wet fingers trying to find a crack in a window, but the window was sealed. One of the larger Void soldiers, a brute with arms like sledgehammers made of glitching smoke, broke the stalemate. It shrieked, a sound of tearing metal, and lunged. Bastian did not flinch. He did not raise a paw. He simply looked at the creature with his new turquoise fire eyes. He didn't see a monster. He saw a stain, a mistake in the fabric of his kingdom. "Cease," Bastian commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was an edit to reality. The blue light from the core pulsed once, violently. The lunging soldier didn't explode. It simply stopped being. The static that formed its body unspooled like a thread pulled from a sweater. In less than a second, the monster unraveled into harmless gray dust, scattering across the floor. The rest of the army recoiled. They had never known fear, for they were the thing that others feared. But now, faced with the avatar of the night, they understood that they were prey. Bastian took a step forward. His paw hit the iron anvil with a resonant clang that sounded like a bell tolling. "This realm is forbidden to you," Bastian's voice echoed, amplified by the magic of the deep. "You are the absence. I am the presence. Leave." The Void soldiers shrieked in protest. They turned to flee, scrambling over each other to reach the shadows, to reach the cracks in the walls, to escape the blinding authority of the new king. But Bastian was not feeling merciful. He remembered the ancient king. He remembered the sacrifice. He looked at the fleeing horde. "No," Bastian whispered. "You do not get to leave. You do not get to hide and wait for me to sleep." Bastian closed his eyes and extended his senses. He felt the shadows in the cavern. Not the void shadows, but the true shadows. The natural darkness cast by the pillars and the stones. He gripped those shadows with his mind. "Wake up," he commanded the darkness. "Hunger." The natural shadows of the cave obeyed. They peeled themselves off the walls. They stretched and elongated, forming massive wolf-like shapes of pure, dense blackness. The night turned against the void. Bastian's shadows chased down the glitching monsters. It was a massacre of silence. The true darkness swallowed the false darkness. There were no screams, only the soft womb of static being extinguished. Within minutes, the anvil was clear. The floor of the cavern was empty, save for piles of gray ash. The invasion of the forge was over. Bastian stood alone in the center of the devastation. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. The crown above his head dimmed slightly, settling into a steady, rhythmic glow that matched the beating of his own heart. He looked up at the core. It was beautiful again. The corruption was gone, burned away by the ancient king's final act and Bastian's ascension. It spun slowly, bathing the cavern in a restorative sapphire light. Bastian felt the connection. He could feel the energy flowing from the core, up through the rock, through the chains of the bridge, and all the way up the tunnel to the citadel above. The lights were back on. The kingdom was safe. But the cost? Bastian looked down at the spot where the ancient king had stood. There was nothing there, just a scorch mark on the stone. Bastian walked over to it. He sat down. He felt a sudden, crushing loneliness. The ancient king had been his guide, his mentor, the father he never had. Now, Bastian was the only one left who remembered the history of the stars. He lowered his head, touching his nose to the scorched stone. "I will hold it," Bastian whispered to the memory of the old lion. "I will hold the crown. I promise." He stayed there for a long moment, letting the grief wash over him one last time before locking it away in the vault of his duties. Then he stood up. He turned his eyes toward the tunnel entrance, the long climb back to the surface. The forge was secure, but the citadel was still in chaos. The high spirits would be panicked. The gates were broken. And somewhere, out in the vast emptiness beyond the walls, the source of the void, the true enemy, was still watching. Bastian shook the ash from his new glossy coat. He was no longer the apprentice. He began the long walk back to the bridge. His shadow stretched out behind him, enormous and regal, darker than the deepest cave. The king was coming home. Chapter 7. The Court of Silence. The climb back to the surface was a journey through strata of silence. Bastian moved up the spiraling throat of the world, his paws striking the stone with a rhythmic certainty that hadn't been there before. Click, click, click. He was tired. His physical body ached from the battle on the anvil, but his spirit felt limitless. The connection to the core hummed in his veins, a constant low-frequency vibration that reminded him, "You are the anchor. You are the wall." As he neared the top of the tunnel, where the mines met the lower basements of the citadel, he began to hear it. It wasn't the silence of the night. It was the noise of fear. It started as a murmur, then grew into a chaotic dissonance of mewling, hissing, and fluttering wings. The citadel, usually a place of absolute, church-like calm, was in panic. The flash of the ancient king's death, that moment when the light of the world had flickered and died before returning, had been felt by everyone. The high spirits knew the old lion was gone, and now they thought they were alone in the dark. Bastian pushed open the heavy iron doors that led back into the main complex. He walked through the corridors of quartz and moonstone. They were deserted. He reached the archway of the great hall, the same hall where, only hours ago, he had been judged as a muddy stray. He paused in the shadows of the entrance, observing. The great hall was a scene of beautiful hysteria. Hundreds of high spirits, the Siamese with diamond collars, the Maine Coons with storm cloud fur, were swirling in the air, their movements jagged and anxious. The ceiling, which usually showed the calm drift of constellations, was spinning wildly. The threads of human sleep, visible through the high balconies, were tangling. Without a conductor, the orchestra of the night was falling out of tune. In the center of the room, Perched on the highest pedestal sat Lyra. The white Persian glowed with a frantic, icy light. Her fur was bristling, her tail lashing back and forth like a whip. She was projecting her thoughts to the crowd, her mental voice sharp and commanding, edging on, screeching. "The king is fallen," Lyra declared, her eyes wide with panic. "I felt his light go out. The void has taken the core." A wave of terrified wails answered her. "We must seal the Citadel," Lyra continued. "We must cut the threads. If we disconnect from the human world, the void cannot follow us here. We must save ourselves." Bastian narrowed his turquoise eyes. To cut the threads would be to abandon the humans. It would leave the waking world defenseless against the nightmares. It was cowardice, masked as survival. "And the stray?" A voice from the crowd asked. "Where is the successor he chose?" Lyra laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "The Mudwalker?" she sneered. "He likely died in the first tunnel. Or he ran. He was a creature of the gutter. He had no honor. He abandoned us the moment the shadows got deep." She stood up, her white silhouette stark against the dark room. "I am the highest of the high spirits," Lyra proclaimed. "I assume command. Close the great gates. Sever the ties to earth." Bastian stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't jump. He walked. His claws clicked against the moonstone floor. Click. Click. The sound was quiet, but it cut through the panic like a razor blade. He didn't need to shout. The crown above his head did the talking. The jagged halo of silver starlight was blazing, casting a cold, hard illumination that reached every corner of the vast hall. One by one, the cats nearest the entrance stopped moving. They landed on the floor, pressing their bellies to the stone, their eyes fixed on the small black figure approaching. The silence spread like a contagion, moving in a wave from the door to the center of the room, until only Lyra remained standing. She froze. She looked down from her pedestal. She saw the stray, but she didn't see the mud. She didn't see the fear. She saw the crown. And she saw the eyes, two burning pools of electric turquoise fire that held the weight of a collapsed star. Bastian stopped in the center of the room, looking up at her. His shadow stretched out across the floor, enormous and dark, swallowing the light of the white Persian. "You will not cut the threads," Bastian said. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in the skulls of every being in the room. It was the voice of the anvil. "You will not seal the gates. You will not abandon the sleepers." Lyra trembled. Her logic fought against her instinct. "You," she stammered. "You are alive, but the king." "The king is dead," Bastian confirmed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Long live the king." He took a step toward the pedestal. "Get down," Bastian whispered. It wasn't a request. Lyra looked at the crown. She looked at the raw power radiating from him. Power that tasted of the deep earth and the ancient forge. She realized, with a jolt of horror, that this was no longer a cat she could bully. This was a force of nature. She shrank. Her white fur flattened. Slowly, humiliatingly, she hopped down from the high pedestal. She lowered her head, averting her gaze. Bastian did not climb the pedestal. He didn't need to be high up to be tall. He sat in the center of the floor, wrapping his tail around his paws. He looked at the hundreds of terrified spirits. "The core is secure," Bastian announced. "The void has been burned out, but the war is not over. Scan the room. Go back to your posts. Fix the tangled threads. Soothe the nightmares. If I see a single thread cut, I will exile the one who cut it to the void." The room remained frozen. They were waiting for permission to breathe. "Move!" Bastian commanded. Instantly, the hall exploded into action. But it wasn't chaotic anymore. It was focused. The high spirits flew to the balconies, their fear replaced by the terrifying clarity of having a commander. Bastian watched them go. Then he looked at Lyra, who was still crouching nearby, waiting for her punishment. "And you?" Bastian said softly. Lyra flinched. "You know the protocols of the court," Bastian said. "I need a herald, someone to organize the weavers while I watch the deep." He paused. "Get to work, Lyra." Lyra looked up, shocked that she wasn't being banished. She saw the mercy in the new king's eyes, the empathy he had promised to keep. She bowed, lower than she had ever bowed to anyone. "Yes, my king." The great hall emptied. The rush of wings and the soft padding of paws faded into the distance as the high spirits returned to their duties. The panic that had gripped the Citadel dissolved, replaced by the low, steady hum of a kingdom at work. Bastian was left alone in the center of the vast chamber. Above him, the ceiling, which had been spinning in chaos, slowed down. The constellations returned to their slow, mathematical drift. The comets resumed their lazy arcs across the obsidian sky. Order had been restored, but order required maintenance. Bastian turned his eyes toward the far end of the hall. There, rising from a dais of polished moonstone, stood the throne. It was the same throne he had seen on the cover of the ancient books in the library of his mind. It was carved from a single block of dark meteoric stone, veined with silver. It was high-backed, gothic, and imposing, decorated with the carved faces of lions, owls, and wolves, the previous kings of the night. It looked uncomfortable, it looked cold, and it looked far too big for a small cat. Bastian approached it slowly. This was the seat of the ancient king. The old lion had filled this throne with his massive bulk, his golden fur spilling over the armrests. Bastian felt a pang of imposter syndrome. He was just a silhouette, a shadow. "Size is just a suggestion," the king's voice echoed in his memory. Bastian took a breath. He leaped up. He landed on the dark velvet cushion of the seat. It was firm, but the moment his paws touched it, the stone seemed to mold itself to him. The throne didn't care about the size of the body. It cared about the weight of the soul. And Bastian's soul was heavy enough. He sat down, assuming the posture of the Sphinx, legs forward, head high, chest expanded. He placed his front paws on the armrests, where the stone was worn smooth by eons of claws, gripping it in tension. Then he closed his eyes, and the throne woke up. It didn't speak with words. It spoke with vision. The walls of the great hall seemed to melt away. The floor became transparent. Suddenly, Bastian wasn't sitting in a castle. He was sitting in the sky. He was suspended directly above the earth, looking down at the spinning blue marble shrouded in shadow. But he didn't just see the planet. He heard it. He heard the collective breathing of billions of living things. Inhale. Exhale. It was a sound like the ocean, vast and rhythmic, the heartbeat of the world. Through the connection of the throne, Bastian's consciousness expanded. He wasn't just one cat anymore. He was a million eyes in the dark. He could zoom in. He focused his will, and his vision plummeted down through the clouds, through a roof in a small town in France, into a nursery. He saw a little girl, tossing in her sleep. Above her bed, a dark shape was forming, a minor nightmare, a little scrap of anxiety that had slipped past the weavers. It looked like a spider made of smoke. Bastian didn't need to leave the throne to fight it. He simply looked at the spider, He projected his authority across the miles. "Leave," he whispered in the language of shadows. The spider shriveled and vanished. The little girl sighed, turned over, and settled into a deep, dreamless sleep. Bastian pulled his vision back. He zoomed down again, this time to a hospital room in Tokyo. An old man lay in a bed, breathing shallowly. He was afraid to let go. He was fighting the sleep because he feared he wouldn't wake up. Bastian felt the man's fear, cold and sharp. Bastian couldn't fix the man's body. That was the domain of the day. But he could fix the night. Bastian projected a thought toward the old man. Not a command, but a feeling. He sent the sensation of the warm rug, the feeling of the fire, the feeling of being held. He sent the purr of the ancient king. The old man's heart rate slowed. The lines of pain on his face smoothed out. He let go. He slept. Bastian felt a small tug of satisfaction. Mender, the king had called him. He sat there for hours, or perhaps minutes. Time was fluid on the throne, watching the world turn. He saw lovers whispering in the dark. He saw thieves hiding in alleyways, and he granted them shadow, for the night does not judge morality, only safety. He saw stray cats huddling under cars, and he sent them small pockets of warmth. It was exhausting. It was endless. Every second, 1,000 new dreams began, and 1,000 new fears tried to take root. Bastian realized then why the ancient king had looked so tired. To hold the crown was to never truly sleep yourself. You had to be the lighthouse. A soft sound broke his concentration. Bastian opened his physical eyes. He was back in the great hall. Lyra was standing at the foot of the dais. She held a silver tray in her mouth. On it sat a bowl of the golden nectar. She placed it on the step and bowed low. "For the king," she whispered, keeping her eyes averted. "The watch is long. You must sustain your light." Bastian looked at her. He saw no trepidation in her aura now, only respect. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, Lyra." She backed away into the shadows. Bastian looked at the bowl. He was hungry. But he didn't move immediately. He looked back into the distance, his turquoise eyes glowing in the dim hall. He missed the alley. He missed the rain. He missed the simplicity of worrying only about his own belly. But then he heard the collective breath of the world again. Inhale. Exhale. He felt the millions of threads held safe in his grasp. He took a sip of the nectar. He settled back onto the velvet cushion. The night was young, and the king was awake. Time in the kingdom of night does not pass in hours or minutes. It passes in cycles of breath. Cycles turned into epochs. Bastian sat on the throne, and with every rotation of the earth below, he grew into the heavy obsidian skin of his new title. The crown, once a jagged halo of wild energy, had settled. It now hovered calmly above his head, a permanent ring of cold silver fire. But Bastian was not content to simply be a watcher. The ancient king had been a lion, regal, distant, a sun in the darkness. He ruled from above. Bastian was a cat of the streets. He knew that the most important things often happened in the gutters, in the cracks, in the places high lords ignored. He descended from the throne. He called for Lyra. "Assemble the court," Bastian commanded. "Not just the high spirits. I want everyone. The moles from the deep mines, the bats from the high belfries, the spiders who weave the silk for the hammocks of dreams." Lyra hesitated, her white fur twitching with ingrained prejudice. "The spiders, my king? The moles? They are workers. They are dirt dwellers. They do not belong in the great hall." Bastian looked at her with his turquoise eyes. "The core was saved because I knew how to dig." Bastian said softly, "The dirt saved us. Bring them." And so, for the first time in the history of the night, the great hall was filled not just with the beautiful glowing spectral cats, but with the lesser things. Giant moles shuffled in, blinking blindly in the dim light, shaking dust from their velvet coats. Great gray moths fluttered down from the rafters, folding their dusty wings. Spiders the size of dinner plates scuttled nervously along the walls. The high spirits looked at them with disdain, pulling their tails away to avoid touching the unclean. Bastian walked through the center of the crowd. He didn't walk toward the high spirits. He walked toward the moles. He stopped in front of the elder mole, the one whose kin had been erased by the void in the mines. "Your tunnels are the veins of this kingdom," Bastian declared, his voice amplifying through the hall. "Without you, the core goes cold. Without the spiders, the nets break. Without the moths, the silence has no texture." Bastian turned to the room. The void attacked us because we were divided. It saw a hierarchy it could break. It saw workers who felt unloved and soldiers who felt superior. The crown flared. "That ends tonight." Bastian raised a paw. "From this night forward, there are no high spirits and low spirits. There are only guardians." He looked at the moles. "I name you the keepers of the foundation. You will have armor forged of star metal to protect you in the deep." He looked at the spiders. "I name you the weavers of safety. Your webs will be strengthened with moonlight." And then he did something that shocked the court. He looked at the shadows in the corners, the nameless, shapeless drifts of darkness that usually went unnoticed. "And I am creating a new order," Bastian announced, "the Order of the Stray." He remembered the cold rain. He remembered the feeling of being invisible. This order will not stay in the castle. They will go down to the waking world. They will walk the alleys. They will sit on the fences of the lonely. They will find the lost souls, the humans who think they are forgotten, and they will bring them comfort. A murmur went through the hall, not of fear this time, but of awe. The ancient king had protected the sleepers. Bastian was proposing to protect the lonely. It was an expansion of the night's mercy. The shadows in the corners swirled and took form. Dozens of lean black cats with eyes like bastions. They bowed. They were his kin, the street cats of the spirit world. "Go," Bastian commanded. "Find the ones who are cold and remind them that the night is watching." As the great hall erupted into a symphony of purrs and chittering approval, a sound of unity that the Citadel had never heard before, Bastian felt a sudden, sharp pain in his temple. It wasn't a headache. It was a warning. The throne was calling him back. He leapt up the dais and settled onto the stone. His vision expanded instantly to the edge of the kingdom. The internal war was won. The kingdom was united. The core was burning bright blue. But looking out past the spires, past the beautiful tapestry of dreams, Bastian saw the horizon. The void had been expelled from the mines, but it hadn't been destroyed. Out there, in the infinite nothingness that surrounded the kingdom, the static was gathering. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was massing. A storm of gray nothingness was building against the walls of reality. A hurricane of silence. Bastian narrowed his eyes. The ancient king had died stopping a saboteur, but Bastian would have to survive a siege. "Prepare the gates," Bastian whispered, his thought echoing to Lyra. "My king?" Lyra asked, confused by the sudden shift in his mood. "The infection is gone," Bastian said, watching the gathering storm clouds of antimatter. "But the fever is coming back, and this time it wants to break the walls down." Chapter 8: The Siege of Silence. The peace of the Night Kingdom was not broken by a trumpet, nor by a roar. It was broken by a sudden, sickening drop in pressure. Bastian sat on the throne of whispers, his turquoise eyes fixed on the distant horizon, the boundary line where the floating continent of the night ended and the infinite cosmos began. Usually, that horizon was a comforting, deep purple, dusted with the glitter of distant galaxies. But tonight, the stars were disappearing. They weren't blinking out one by one. They were being wiped away in clusters, as if a giant wet rag were being dragged across the chalkboard of the universe. A wall of gray was rising. It was a storm, but it had no clouds. It was a tsunami of static, white noise, given physical form. It boiled and churned, silent and unstoppable, rushing toward the kingdom at the speed of thought. "It is here," Bastian whispered. His thought echoed through the Citadel, reaching every corner of the realm instantly. Lyra, standing by the great gates, looked up. Her white fur stood on end as the static charge in the air spiked. "The shields!" Lyra screamed to the high spirits guarding the perimeter. "Raise the lunar wards." Hundreds of winged cats took flight, their bodies glowing with silver light. They formed a geometric net in the sky, linking their magic together to create a dome of protection over the Citadel, just in time. The wave of void hit the barrier. Boom! The sound was not heard. It was felt. It vibrated in the teeth of every creature in the kingdom. It shook the dust from the rafters of the great hall. The dome of silver light buckled inward, straining under the weight of the nothingness pressing against it. Bastian did not leave the throne. He couldn't. He was the anchor. He gripped the stone armrests, his claws sinking into the meteor rock. He channeled the power of the core through his own body, beating it into the shield. He felt the impact as if it were a physical blow to his own ribs. "Hold!" he gritted out, his mental voice straining. "We are the night. We do not break." Outside, the sky had turned a terrifying flat gray. The beautiful darkness was gone, replaced by the color of a dead television channel. And out of that gray ocean, the Leviathans emerged. These were not the man-sized soldiers Bastian had fought in the forge. These were the siege engines of the void. They looked like whales made of glitching, jagged static. They swam through the emptiness, opening mouths that were vast tears in reality. One of the Leviathans slammed its bulk against the lunar ward. The shield crackled. Sparks of blue magic rained down on the city like fireworks. A crack appeared in the sky, a jagged line of white fracture running through the protective dome. "The barrier is fracturing," a high spirit cried out, diving to avoid the falling sparks. Bastian saw the crack. He felt the cold vacuum leaking in. He knew that if he tried to patch it with magic alone, he would burn out, just as the ancient king had. He needed structure. He needed mass. He projected his voice downwards, into the roots of the floating continent. "Keepers of the foundation!" Bastian roared into the earth. "The sky is falling. Hold it up." Deep in the mines, thousands of giant moles heard the call. They didn't panic. They didn't run. They were creatures of the earth, and they knew how to bear weight. The elder mole slammed his star metal shovel into the ground. "Brace!" he bellowed. The moles began to chant, a low, resonant hum that vibrated at the exact frequency of the stone. They channeled the energy of the earth upward into the pillars of the Citadel. Above, in the throne room, the floor shuddered. Great beams of obsidian rose from the ground, soaring up toward the cracked sky. They were physical reinforcements, pillars of stone growing rapidly to support the failing magical shield. The stone met the magic. The cracks stabilized. The Leviathan rammed the shield again, but this time the kingdom held firm. The stone absorbed the shock. Bastian exhaled, his chest heaving. The first wave was stopped, but the gray ocean outside was teeming with movement. More Leviathans were gathering, and smaller shapes, millions of them, were swarming off the backs of the great beasts like fleas. "They are not just trying to break in," Lyra reported, her voice tight with fear. "They are trying to surround us. They want to cut off the light of the stars." Bastian looked at the tapestry of dreams below the balcony. The silver threads of the human sleepers were swaying violently in the turbulence. If they surround us, Bastian realized, they will block the connection to Earth. The humans will wake up in a world without dreams. They will go mad. Bastian stood up on the throne. He looked at his new army, the spiders spinning reinforcement webs over the windows, the moths dusting the air with confusion scales, the cats of the stray order sharpening their spectral claws. This was not a skirmish. This was the war for sanity. "Open the upper gates," Bastian commanded. Lyra whipped her head around. "My king? If we open the gates, the static will get in." "No," Bastian said, his turquoise eyes blazing with cold fire. "If we stay inside, we are just waiting to be crushed. We are cats. We do not hide in the hole when the rat comes." The crown above his head spun faster, generating a hum of power that made the air tremble. "We hunt." Bastian leaped from the throne. "High spirits with me. We take the fight to the gray." The King of Night strode toward the balcony, ready to lead the charge into the storm. The upper gates of the Citadel swung open. It was not a sound of metal grinding on stone. It was the sound of a deep breath being released. The protective lunar shield shimmered and parted, creating a narrow corridor of exposure, a bridge between the sanctuary of the night and the chaos of the void. Bastian stood at the threshold. Behind him were 500 high spirits, the winged cats, the stormbringers, the luminous panthers of the upper atmosphere. They were vibrating with energy, their fur bristling with static, their eyes locking onto the gray abyss ahead. In front of him lay the void. It was a terrifying sight. The gray ocean of static was swirling with hungry intent. The Leviathans, those whales of glitching antimatter, were circling, waiting for the shield to fail completely. Bastian looked at the gray. It was ugly. It was boring. It was the end of all stories. "We do not just fight them," Bastian projected to his army. "We paint over them." The crown of the Night King flared with a blinding turquoise light. "Charge!" Bastian leaped. He didn't jump down, he jumped out. He ran upon the empty air as if it were solid ground, his paws creating ripples of blue neon light with every stride. The high spirits followed. It looked like a waterfall of diamonds pouring out of the Citadel. They crashed into the gray wall of the void. The impact was silent but dazzling. Where the high spirits touched the static, color exploded. A Maine Coon spirit slashed at a cloud of gray fog, and from the wound erupted a thunderstorm of purple lightning. A Siamese spirit bit into a tentacle of silence, and the wound bled pure, liquid gold. The void was the absence of things. The night was the abundance of things. When they collided, reality reasserted itself with violence. Bastian aimed for the nearest Leviathan. The beast was colossal, a mountain of twitching white noise. It opened a mouth that looked like a jagged tear in a photograph. Bastian didn't dodge. He was the king. He was the most real thing in the universe. He dove straight toward the monster's face. He amplified the light of the crown. "I see you," Bastian roared. The void relies on being vague. It relies on being unformed. By forcing his gaze upon it, by perceiving it with the absolute clarity of the king's eyes, Bastian forced the monster to define itself. And it couldn't. Under the intense pressure of Bastian's observation, the Leviathan panicked. Its static form crystallized. It turned from smoke to brittle gray glass. Bastian struck it with one paw. Crack. The sound rang out like a bell across the battlefield. The glass Leviathan shattered into a billion harmless shards, raining down into the deep like glitter. "They are brittle," Lyra shouted from his left flank. She was fighting like a white dervish, tearing through the smaller void creatures. "They cannot handle the definition, cannot handle the shape." "Then give them shape," Bastian commanded. "Do not just claw at them, create." The army understood. This wasn't a war of muscles. It was a war of imagination. The high spirits stopped fighting like animals and started fighting like gods. They began to manifest their nature. One cat summoned a blizzard of frozen starlight, freezing a squadron of void insects in midair. Another summoned the gravity of a black hole, sucking the static into a singularity and crushing it. The battlefield transformed. What was once a gray, dead ocean was now blooming with impossible colors. Nebulas of pink and green, storms of gold, hail of silver. They were terraforming the nothingness. Bastian ran through the chaos, a streak of black and turquoise. He felt powerful. He felt the joy of creation. Every enemy he destroyed was a nightmare prevented. Every mile of ground he reclaimed was a sanctuary for a dreamer. But as they pushed the gray ocean back, Bastian looked toward the deep horizon. His heart sank. They were winning the battle, but the ocean was infinite. For every Leviathan they shattered, two more emerged from the deep distance. The gray wall stretched on forever. The void was vast. The kingdom was small. His army was brave, but they were finite. He could see Lyra slowing down, her light dimming. He could see the high spirits panting, their magic reserves draining. They could not fight forever. The void didn't need to win. It just needed to wait. It would wear them down, century by century, until the last light flickered out. Bastian stopped in midair, hovering on a platform of will. He looked back at the Citadel. It shone like a jewel in the darkness. He looked at the endless gray tsunami approaching from the deep. We cannot kill it all, Bastian realized. There is too much of nothing. He needed a wall, not a temporary shield made of magic that drained their energy, but a permanent boundary. A line in the sand that the void could not cross. He looked at the crown above his head. He looked at the core burning in the depths of the floating continent. He realized what the ancient king had done. The ancient king had been a battery. He had burned himself to keep the lights on. Bastian didn't want to be a battery. He wanted to be a lighthouse. A lighthouse doesn't fight the ocean. It warns it. It draws a line with light. "Lyra," Bastian projected, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. "My king," she answered, blasting a shadow wolf with a beam of light. "Fall back," Bastian ordered. "But we are winning." "We are spending energy we cannot replace," Bastian retorted. "Fall back to the walls, all of you. Retreat to the perimeter." "What about you?" Lyra screamed, sensing his intent. Bastian turned his back on the safety of the Citadel. He faced the infinite gray horizon alone. "I am going to draw a line," Bastian whispered. "I am going to set the border on fire." The army hesitated, then obeyed. They streamed back toward the Citadel, leaving the king alone in the void. Bastian closed his eyes. He reached down, deep into the connection he had forged on the anvil. He pulled. He didn't pull a sword. He pulled the core itself. He channeled the entire output of the Starforge up through the roots, through the tower, through the throne, and out through his own body. It hurt. It felt like his veins were carrying liquid sun, but he held it. He opened his eyes. They were blinding white. This far. Bastian spoke to the universe, and no further. Bastian floated in the nothingness. To his left and right, the gray ocean of the void stretched out forever, a wall of static waiting to crash down. Behind him, the Citadel was a speck of obsidian light. Inside him, the fire of a star was burning. He felt the energy of the core rushing through his limbs. It was agonizing and ecstatic all at once. It felt as if his small, physical body was being stretched, turning into a vessel of pure geometry and light. He took a deep breath, inhaling the vacuum, exhaling will, and then he released it. He didn't fire the energy as a weapon. He didn't aim at the Leviathans. Instead, Bastian let out a low, resonant purr that vibrated through the fabric of reality. The light from the core exploded outward from his body, but not in a straight line. It curved. It shot out to the left and to the right, racing along the horizon line faster than the speed of thought. It was painting a border. Where the blue-white light touched the gray static, the static hissed and solidified. The chaotic, glitching ocean was forced to stop. Bastian spun in the air, tracing the perimeter of his kingdom with a ribbon of fire. He was building a wall, but not a wall of stone. Stone can be broken. Stone can be eroded. He was building a wall of light. The energy stabilized. Rising from the edge of the floating continent, a colossal curtain of light shimmered into existence. It looked like the aurora borealis, a vast undulating sheet of turquoise, violet, and silver energy that stretched up from the abyss and vanished into the high cosmos. It moved slowly, drifting and folding like silk in a gentle breeze. It was beautiful, and it was absolute. The Leviathans of the void slammed into it. Hiss. They didn't break through. They bounced off. The aurora burned them, not with heat, but with truth. The light forced them to define themselves, and since they were made of nothing, they simply evaporated upon contact. The gray ocean recoiled. The void realized that this was not a shield that could be cracked. This was a new law of physics. Here is the light, there is the dark, and never again shall they mix. Bastian watched the gray tide retreat. It pulled back mile after mile until it was just a faint static haze on the far horizon, hidden behind the majestic curtain of the aurora. The silence returned, but it wasn't the hungry silence of the mines, nor was it the terrified silence of the siege. It was a deep, resonant, holy silence. The silence of a library after the doors are locked, the silence of a heavy snowfall. Bastian floated there for a long time, watching the lights dance. He felt drained. His fur was no longer glowing. It had returned to the deep, matte black of midnight. The crown above his head was dim, pulsing slowly, resting. He had drawn the line. He had finished the work the ancient king started. The old lion had lit the fire. The black cat had built the lantern. Slowly, drifting like a leaf on a calm pond, Bastian turned back toward the Citadel. The gates were open. Standing on the threshold were Lyra and the High Spirits. Behind them stood the moles, the spiders, and the strays. They were not cheering. This wasn't a moment for noise. They were bowing. Every single creature in the kingdom of night was bowed low, their heads touching the moonstone floor. Bastian glided down, his paws touching the solid ground of the bridge. He walked past them. He nodded to Lyra. He nodded to the elder mole. He walked through the great hall, past the quartz pillars, past the tapestries now glowing with the reflection of the aurora outside. He climbed the dais. He didn't sit on the throne immediately. He curled up on the rug at the foot of the throne. The stone was cool. The air was safe. For the first time since he left London, Bastian closed his eyes not to blink, or to focus, or to command. He closed his eyes to rest. The war was over. The long night had begun. Chapter 9. The Rhythm of Eternity. Peace is not merely the absence of war. In the kingdom of night, peace is a physical weight. It is a warm, heavy blanket that settles over the shoulders, pressing down the worries of the day until they are flat and forgotten. The Citadel had changed. Before, it was a fortress of solitude, a place of high, cold towers and anxious sentries. Now, it was a sanctuary. High above the obsidian spires, the great aurora, the barrier Bastian had forged, drifted in slow, hypnotic waves. Ribbons of turquoise and violet light folded over each other in silence, a permanent reminder that the darkness outside could no longer get in. The light from the aurora washed over the castle, softening the sharp edges of the stone, turning the black rock into deep, shimmering indigo. Bastian walked the corridors. He did not rush. A king does not run. He moved with a fluid, liquid grace, his paws making no sound on the cool floor. The crown of starlight hovered above his head, but it no longer blazed with the blinding fire of battle. Now, it glowed with the soft, steady luminescence of a harvest moon. He passed the open archways of the weaving halls. Inside, the work of the night continued. But the atmosphere had shifted. Before, the high spirits worked alone, arrogant and distant. Now, they worked in tandem with the spiders. Bastian watched as a great gray moth fluttered its wings, releasing a dust of sleep over a tangled thread. A spider, hanging from a silver web, deftly caught the thread and smoothed out the knot. A high spirit, a Siamese, with eyes like sapphires, hummed a low lullaby to seal the repair. It was an orchestra. There was no conductor, only a shared rhythm. Click, flutter. Click, flutter. It was the heartbeat of the world's rest. Bastian stopped to watch them. He felt the vibration of the work in his whiskers. It was soothing. It was the sound of a machine running perfectly. Lyra approached him. She walked softly, her white fur glowing in the dim light. "The threads are calm tonight, my king," she whispered. "The world is tired," Bastian replied softly. "Winter is coming in the waking lands. The humans are seeking warmth. They are burrowing deep." "The moles have reinforced the foundations," Lyra reported. "The deep hum of the earth is stable." Bastian nodded. He looked at Lyra. The sharpness was gone from her face. She looked content. She looked like a creature who had found her purpose. "Rest, Lyra," Bastian said. "The watch is mine for now." She bowed and retreated to a velvet cushion in the corner, curling her tail over her nose. Within moments, her breathing slowed to a deep, rhythmic rise and fall. Bastian continued his patrol. He walked out onto the great balcony that overlooked the tapestry of Somnus. Below him, the field of silver threads stretched out to infinity, swaying gently like tall grass in a summer breeze. There were no dark spots, no parasites, no void beasts prowling the edges. The aurora cast its protective light over the entire field, bathing the dreams of humanity in a safe, colorful glow. Bastian sat down at the edge of the balcony. He wrapped his tail around his paws. He took a deep breath of the air. It smelled of ozone, starlight, and old books. He felt the connection to the core, that warm, golden fire in his chest. It wasn't burning him anymore. It was sustaining him. It was an eternal ember that kept the cold away. He looked down at the world of humans, that turning blue sphere far below. He wondered if the old woman was sleeping. He wondered if she was warm. He closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, gently touching the millions of threads. He didn't pull. He didn't intrude. He just held them. Like a cat sitting on the chest of a sleeping owner, his presence was a weight that said, "I am here. You are safe. Nothing can touch you." The night was vast. The night was dark. But the night was kind. And under the watch of the Black King, the silence was not empty. It was full of peace. The Citadel was the heart of the night, but the blood of the kingdom flowed far below, in the veins of the waking world. Bastian sat on the edge of the balcony, his gaze fixed on the turning blue sphere of Earth. To the naked eye, the world was asleep. The cities were dim clusters of amber light. The oceans were vast expanses of black ink. But Bastian did not see with naked eyes. He blinked, and his vision shifted. He activated the connection to the Order of the Stray, the legion of black cats, alley wanderers, and house pets he had deputized to be his agents on the ground. Suddenly, he was no longer just one cat on a throne. He was a million cats at once. He felt the texture of a million different rugs. He smelled the scent of wood smoke in 1,000 different chimneys. He tasted the cream left in 1,000 different bowls. He focused on a farmhouse in the middle of a winter storm in Nebraska. Through the eyes of a small, one-eared tomcat named Shadow, Bastian saw a drafty hallway. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window panes. But there was something else in the wind, a minor spirit of cold anxiety, a little wisp of frost trying to slide under the door crack. It wanted to reach the bedroom, where a family slept under heavy quilts. It wanted to whisper worries about the harvest and the heating bill into their ears. Bastian felt Shadow's muscles tense. The tomcat didn't need a sword or a spell. He simply walked over to the door crack. He lay down. He pressed his warm, fur-covered belly against the gap. He began to purr. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The sound was low and visceral. It vibrated against the wood. The wisp of frost hit the wall of purring and shattered. The anxiety dissolved, unable to cross the barrier of simple physical contentment. The family slept on, unaware that a battle had been fought and won on their doormat. Bastian smiled in the Citadel. Good boy, he projected. He shifted his focus. He traveled halfway across the world to a high-rise apartment in Seoul. A young woman was tossing in her sleep. Her brow was furrowed. Her breathing was shallow and fast. Sitting on her chest was a sleek black cat named Luna. Luna was staring intently at the air above the woman's head. Bastian looked through Luna's eyes. He saw a dark gray cloud forming. A memory of a mistake made it work, looping over and over again. A nightmare of regret. Luna didn't swat at it. She slowly lowered her head and touched her nose to the woman's chin. She started the frequency. The purr of the night is not just a sound. It is a frequency of healing. It is the exact vibration required to repair bone and knit spirit. Luna purred, and Bastian pushed a little of his own power through the connection. The gray cloud vibrated. It lost its cohesion. The woman's breathing slowed. The frown lines on her forehead smoothed out. She turned her head, burying her face in the pillow, and drifted into a deeper, safer layer of sleep. The nightmare was gone, eaten by the vibration. Bastian pulled back, his consciousness skimming over rooftops and forests. He checked on the strays huddled under cars in rainy cities. He sent them warmth from the core, raising their body temperatures just enough to ward off the chill. He checked on the barn cats watching over sleeping horses. He checked on the pampered pets sleeping at the foot of king-sized beds. Everywhere he looked, he saw his soldiers. They were silent, they were vigilant. They were the unsung guardians of the human race. Humans thought cats stared at walls because they were crazy. Humans thought cats ran around at 3 a.m. because they were restless. They didn't know. They didn't see the tiny shadows the cats were chasing away. They didn't hear the doors being locked in the astral plane. Bastian withdrew from the connection, returning to his own body on the high balcony of the Citadel. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The system was working. The ancient king had tried to do it all himself, a single sun trying to light the whole world. Bastian had built a network. He had turned every shadow in every room into a safe harbor. "They are safe," Bastian whispered to the wind. "The doors are guarded." He stood up and stretched, arching his back until his spine popped pleasantly. The work of the night was never truly done, but for now, the pressure held. The aurora shimmered above him, casting a turquoise glow over his black fur. He turned back toward the warmth of the great hall. It was time to rest. Even the king needed to close his eyes, if only for a moment, to dream the dreams that would shape tomorrow. Bastian turned away from the balcony, leaving the view of the sleeping earth behind him. He moved deeper into the anatomy of the Citadel, moving toward the very center of the floating continent. Here, the architecture changed. The soaring, open arches of the outer palace gave way to narrower corridors lined with stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. This was the quiet sector, the place where even the whispers of the high spirits were forbidden. Bastian walked alone. His paws touched the floor with a softness that defied the laws of physics. He was no longer just walking. He was drifting, a shadow moving through a world of shadows. The air here was cool and smelled of things that were incredibly old. The scent of dry parchment, of dust that had settled for 1,000 years, and the faint metallic tang of dried ink. He reached the heavy double doors of the Hall of Records. They were carved from slabs of black ice, etched with silver runes that shifted and changed every time you looked at them. They were the names of every dreamer who had ever lived, appearing and fading like breath on glass. Bastian pushed the doors open with a touch of his mind. They swung inward without a sound. He stepped into the library of the gods. The Hall of Records was not a room. It was a canyon. It stretched upward into darkness, the ceiling lost to the eye. Lining the walls, reaching up miles into the gloom, were shelves, millions of them. And on these shelves rested the scrolls of shadow. These were not paper scrolls. They were woven strands of twilight, captured moments of time, cataloged, and stored for eternity. Each scroll contained a dream. Some glowed with a soft golden light, the dreams of love, of flying, of reuniting with lost friends. Some pulsed with a dull, gray throb, the dreams of anxiety, of being late, of losing one's way. But they were all quiet now. They were filed away. Finished stories. Bastian walked down the central aisle, feeling tiny against the scale of history. The silence here was heavy. It pressed against his fur like a weighted blanket. It was a silence that demanded reverence. He approached the central lectern, a massive block of obsidian rising from the floor like an altar. On it lay the great book, This was not a record of dreams. It was the record of kings. Bastian hopped up onto the lectern. The book was open. The pages were made of pressed starlight, thin and durable as diamond. He looked at the page on the left. It was filled with intricate, flowing calligraphy written in ink that shone like molten gold. It told the story of the ancient king. Bastian read the final lines, his green eyes scanning the glowing text. And the lion gave his light to the core, and the fire consumed him, and his watch ended in glory. The ink was dry, the story was sealed. Bastian looked to the page on the right. The page was fresh, the ink was still wet, glistening with a turquoise hue that matched the fire in Bastian's own eyes. At the top of the page, an illustration was forming. It showed a small, sleek, black cat. Above its head floated a jagged crown of silver starlight. The cat was standing on an anvil, surrounded by the defeated shadows of the void. Bastian stared at the image. He felt a strange sense of dislocation. Was that him? He remembered the cold rain of the London alleyway. He remembered the taste of the rotten fishbone he had fought a rat for. He remembered the rough texture of the brick wall against his shivering spine. Those memories felt sharp, real, tactile. But the image in the book, the King of Night, that felt like a myth. He realized with a pang of gentle melancholy that Bastian the Stray was fading. The cat who had a name, the cat who wanted a bowl of milk, the cat who feared the broom. He was becoming a ghost. In his place, a symbol was growing, an entity, a force of nature. I am fading, Bastian whispered to the empty library, and I am becoming. It wasn't a sad thought, it was just the truth. Like the caterpillar forgetting the leaf so it could become the moth. He watched as a spectral quill, held by no hand, dipped itself into a well of shadow ink and began to write on the page. Scritch, scratch, scritch. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. It was the only sound in the entire world. Bastian watched the words form. He expected grand tales. He expected the quill to write about the Battle of the Aurora or the destruction of the Leviathans. But the quill did not write of war. It wrote. The king sat on the balcony. The wind was gentle. The king watched the earth turn. The child in the farmhouse slept without fear. The woman in the city found peace. And the night was quiet. Bastian purred. A deep, rumbling sound that vibrated in his chest. This was what he wanted. A boring history. Heroes want adventures. Kings want boredom. Because when the history books are boring, it means the people are safe. It means no monsters broke the gates. It means no fires burned the cities. Keep writing, Bastian murmured to the quill. Write 1,000 pages of nothing. Write 1,000,000 years of silence. He watched the quill move for what felt like hours. Scritch, scratch. The repetition was soothing. It acted like a lullaby, untying the knots of tension that still lingered in his muscles from the war. His eyelids grew heavy. The adrenaline of the ascension was gone. The focus of the siege was gone. Now, there was only the heavy, irresistible gravity of rest. Bastian looked around the lectern. In the corner of the obsidian table, someone, perhaps Lyra, perhaps the magic of the room itself, had placed a cushion. It was made of midnight blue velvet, stuffed with down that felt like clouds. Bastian walked over to it. He stepped onto the cushion. He began the ritual. Left paw, right paw, left paw, right paw. He kneaded the velvet, his claws extending and retracting in a slow, rhythmic motion, making the bread, preparing the bed. He turned in a circle, once, twice, 3 times. ensuring the world was aligned, ensuring his spine was curved just right. He collapsed. It wasn't a fall, it was a surrender. He let his bones melt into the cushion. He let the stone of the lectern support his weight. He tucked his front paws under his chest. He swept his long black tail around his body, covering his nose, creating a closed circle of warmth. The crown of starlight above his head sensed his state. It stopped spinning. It dimmed. The bright, hard silver light faded down to a soft, warm ember, a nightlight hovering in the dark, just bright enough to keep the shadows at bay, but dim enough to allow for dreams. Bastian closed his eyes. The darkness took him, but it wasn't the scary darkness of the void. It wasn't the lonely darkness of the alley. It was the velvet void, the darkness that heals. He felt his consciousness expanding, drifting out of his body, floating up into the rafters of the library, drifting out through the walls, up into the aurora. He was no longer a cat in a room. He was the night itself. He was the silence between the crickets' chirps. He was the shadow under the bed. He was the cool side of the pillow. He was everywhere. And he was asleep. And because the king slept, the kingdom held its breath. The scroll continued to fill with words, line after line of peace, unrolling into forever.